She spent $300,000 on a car that no one in the country could fix. 6 weeks. 9 specialists, 4 luxury dealerships. Nothing. Then her GPS led her to a garage so small she almost drove past it, where a man in a torn work shirt listened to her engine for 47 seconds and told her exactly what was wrong. She laughed in his face. He didn't flinch. By the next morning, she wasn't laughing anymore. This is a story about the mechanic no one satisfying saw coming, and the satisfying billionaire who almost satisfying missed him entirely. Stay with me until the very end. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The Aston Martin Vanquish had been making the sound for 6 weeks, and it was driving Celine Ashbourne out of her mind. Not the kind of sound most people would notice. Not a rattle or a knock or anything so obvious. It was subtler than that. A faint hesitation in the engine's breath, a half-second delay between the moment her foot pressed the accelerator and the moment the car responded. Like the engine was thinking about it first, deciding whether to obey. For anyone else, it would have been nothing, background noise. But Celine hadn't built a 9-figure portfolio by ignoring things that felt wrong, and this felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate to anyone who hadn't spent serious time behind the wheel of a precision machine. She was sitting in the parking structure beneath her office tower in downtown Hartford when she made the 9th phone call in 2 days. Her assistant, Grace, had already compiled a list of every authorized Aston Martin service center on the East Coast, and Celine had crossed off every single one. "Whitfield Motorworks says they can take it next Tuesday," Grace said through the speakerphone, her voice carrying that particular flatness that meant she already knew what Celine's answer would be. Whitfield already had it for 4 days. They charged me $11,000 to tell me nothing was wrong. Right. And Morrison Elite replaced the fuel injectors, which didn't need replacing, and then suggested the issue might be psychological. Celine leaned back in the leather seat and stared at the concrete ceiling above her. Psychological for a car. Grace was quiet for a moment. There is one more place. It came up on a forum. Not an official one, just a thread where some collectors were talking about hard-to-diagnose issues with older Vanquish models. Someone mentioned a garage in Millbrook. Millbrook? Celine said the word like she was tasting something unfamiliar. Connecticut? It's about an hour and 40 minutes from you. Small town. The garage is called Ellsworth Auto. One-man operation from what I can tell. No website, no social media, just a phone number and a couple of mentions on enthusiast boards. One man. One man. Celine closed her eyes. She had taken this car to facilities with hydraulic lifts that cost more than most houses, staffed by technicians wearing lab coats, surrounded by computer systems that could map every molecule of an engine's combustion cycle. And now her assistant was suggesting she drive an hour and 40 minutes to some backroad operation run by a single person whose entire digital footprint consisted of a phone number. What did the forum posts actually say? Grace paused. Celine could hear her scrolling. One guy says, Ellsworth found what Aston Martin UK couldn't. Another one just says, if you can't fix it, sell the car. That's about it. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. You've exhausted every ringing endorsement on the Eastern Seaboard. Celine almost smiled. Grace had been with her for 4 years and had long since stopped pretending that deference was part of her job description. It was one of the reasons Celine kept her around. Fine, Celine said. Get me the address. Matbon. The drive to Millbrook took longer than the GPS predicted because Celine hit construction outside of Waterbury and spent 20 minutes crawling past orange cones while the Vanquish made that sound, that tiny, infuriating hesitation. Every time traffic moved forward, another car length. By the time she turned off the state highway onto a 2-lane road lined with maples, just starting to think about turning color, her jaw was tight and her patience was somewhere back on I-84. Millbrook was exactly what she'd expected. A town that existed because it had always existed, not because anyone had recently decided it should. A general store with a hand-painted sign, a post office the size of a bedroom, a church with a steeple that needed paint, houses set back from the road with yards that were more functional than decorative, a truck on blocks here, a garden going slightly wild there, a swing set with one swing missing. The GPS directed her down a side street, then another, and then announced that she had arrived at her destination, which appeared to be a gravel lot in front of a cinder block building with a single bay door, half open. A sign above the door read, Ellsworth Auto, in faded block letters that might have been blue once. Next to the garage sat a small house. White clapboard, green shutters. A porch with two mismatched chairs and a bicycle lying on its side in the grass. Celine pulled the Vanquish onto the gravel and sat there for a moment, engine running. Through the open bay door, she could see the tail end of an older sedan up on a lift, and beneath it, a pair of legs in dark work pants. Somewhere inside, a radio was playing something she couldn't quite make out. She turned off the engine and stepped out. She was wearing what she always wore to non-client meetings. Dark slacks, a silk blouse, flat shoes that cost more than most people's rent. Her hair was pulled back. No jewelry except the watch, which was a Patek Philippe her father had given her before he died and which she wore every day regardless of context. She didn't think about what she looked like. She rarely did. That was a luxury you could afford when you'd stopped caring what most people thought of you. The gravel crunched under her shoes as she walked toward the bay door. Hello? The legs under the sedan didn't move. The radio played on. She could hear it now, some old rock station, the kind of thing that came through on AM frequencies in towns like this. Excuse me, hello? A rolling creeper slid out from under the sedan, and a man sat up, wiping his hands on a rag that was already past the point of absorbing anything. He was maybe her age, maybe a year or two older, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. He was wearing a gray work shirt so faded and soft, it looked like it had been washed several hundred times. There was a smear of something dark across his forehead, and his eyes were the kind of tired that didn't come from one bad night, but from years of not quite getting enough sleep. He looked at her. Then he looked past her, at the Vanquish sitting on the gravel, gleaming in the afternoon light like a piece of sculpture someone had accidentally parked in a junkyard. Help you? He said. Are you Ellsworth? Ronan Ellsworth, yeah. Celine Ashbourne. I have a problem with my car. He looked at the Vanquish again. His expression didn't change. She was used to people reacting to the car, the slight widening of the eyes, the involuntary step closer, the sudden shift in posture that said money. Ronan Ellsworth just looked at it the way you'd look at a dog someone brought to the vet. Professionally. Without sentiment. What's it doing? He said. There's a hesitation in the throttle response. Very slight. Almost undetectable, but it's there. It started about 6 weeks ago, and it's gotten marginally worse. I've had it to 4 different authorized service centers and 2 independent specialists. Nobody can find anything wrong. He nodded slowly, like he was processing this. Then he stood up, tucked the rag into his back pocket, and walked past her toward the car. He didn't ask for the keys. He didn't open the hood. He just stood next to the driver's side, leaned down slightly, and said, "Start it up for me." Celine hesitated. "Don't you want to—" "Just start it up." She got in, turned the key. The engine came to life with that deep, particular sound that only a 12-cylinder Aston Martin makes. A sound that had once been her favorite thing about owning the car, and now made her want to put her fist through the dashboard. Ronan stood beside the open door with his head tilted slightly, the way a musician might lean toward a speaker to catch a note no one else could hear. His eyes were half closed. He wasn't looking at anything. He was listening. Celine sat in the driver's seat and watched him. The whole thing felt absurd. She'd driven nearly 2 hours to watch a man in a stained shirt stand next to her car with his eyes closed, doing absolutely nothing. "Rev it," he said. "Gently. Just bring it up till about 3,000 and hold it." She pressed the accelerator. The engine rose. "Now let it drop back to idle." She did. Again, same thing. She did it again. Ronan's head moved almost imperceptibly, tracking something she couldn't perceive. After the 3rd time, he held up his hand. "Okay, shut it off." She killed the engine. "Well?" He straightened up and looked at her. "Your secondary throttle actuator is losing calibration intermittently. It's a known issue on this generation of the V12, but it doesn't show up on standard diagnostics because the deviation is within factory tolerance. The ECU isn't flagging it because technically the readings are still in spec, but you're feeling it because the response curve is drifting about 40 milliseconds off baseline under light throttle input. Under heavy acceleration, the system compensates. Under light input, it doesn't." Celine stared at him. It's not a parts failure, he continued, already turning back toward his garage. It's a calibration drift. The actuator motor is fine. The sensor is fine. But the control module's reference voltage is shifting with temperature. Probably a cold solder joint on the ECU board itself. Microscopic. You'd need to pull the board and look at it under magnification. He said all of this the way someone else might say, "You're low on windshield fluid." Celine got out of the car. Every specialist I've seen ran full diagnostics. One of them had the car for 4 days. They found nothing. They were looking at the data. The data says the car is fine. The car isn't fine. He shrugged. Most people trust the computer more than the car. And you trust your ears more than the computer. I trust what the engine is telling me. The computer is just translating, and sometimes the translation is wrong. She stood there on the gravel, in the late afternoon light, looking at this man in his faded shirt in front of his cinder-block garage, and she felt something she almost never felt in her professional or personal life. Uncertainty about whether she was the smartest person in the conversation. "How long to fix it?" she said. "I'll need to pull the ECU, reflow the solder, and recalibrate. Call it 5-6 hours. And you can do this." He looked at her. Not offended. Not defensive. Just patient. The way you'd be patient with someone who kept asking if water was really wet. "I can do this." "You're not just guessing." "No. Because if I leave this car with you and come back tomorrow and it's the same, it won't be the same. Come back at 8 in the morning. It'll be ready." Celine studied him for a long moment. She was good at reading people. It was half the reason she'd made her money. She could usually tell within 30 seconds whether someone was competent or performing competence, whether they were confident or faking it. Ronan Ellsworth wasn't performing anything. He wasn't trying to impress her or reassure her or sell her on his abilities. He was simply stating what he knew to be true, and if she chose not to believe him, that was her business. "All right," she said. "I'll need a ride back to town. Is there a car service around here?" For the first time, something like amusement crossed his face. "There's Linda at the general store. She's got a pickup. She'll probably give you a ride to the train station in Kent if you ask nice." Celine almost laughed. "Fine, 8 o'clock. She was halfway across the gravel when the screen door of the little white house banged open and a girl came flying down the porch steps. She was 9 or 10, with dark hair and a ponytail, and a pair of jeans with grass stains on both knees. She was carrying a math textbook under one arm and a juice box in the other hand, and she crossed the yard at a full run, heading straight for Ronan. "Dad!" "Mrs. Tierney says I have to do the extra credit because she says I'm not applying myself, which is not even true because I got an 87 on the last test, and Tommy Ruiz got a 72 and she didn't say anything to him." "Lila," Ronan said, "we have a customer." The girl stopped mid-sentence and looked at Celine with frank curiosity. No shyness, no self-consciousness. Just the open, evaluating gaze of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't interested. "Hi," she said. "Is that your car?" "It is." "It's really shiny. What's wrong with it?" "Lila," Ronan said again, but there was no sharpness in it. Just the mild, habitual course correction of a parent who'd had this conversation 1,000 times. "The engine has a problem," Celine said. "Your dad says he can fix it." Lila shrugged. "He can fix anything. He fixed Mr. Garza's truck, and Mr. Garza said it was impossible, and then Dad fixed it anyway, and Mr. Garza brought us a pie." She looked up at Ronan. "Is she going to bring us a pie?" "Go do your homework." "But the extra credit." "Do the extra credit too. Mrs. Tierney's right. You're coasting. I got an 87. You could get a 97 and you know it. Go." Lila looked at him with an expression that suggested she had several more arguments prepared and was choosing, strategically, to deploy them later. Then she looked at Celine, said, "You don't have to bring a pie. A cake is fine too," and walked back toward the house with the exaggerated dignity of someone who wanted it known she was leaving by choice. Ronan watched her go. And Celine watched Ronan watch her go, and saw something she hadn't expected to see on the face of a grease-stained mechanic in a backwater town. A love so total and unguarded it made her chest ache for reasons she didn't care to examine. "She's something," Celine said. "She's everything," Ronan said. Then, as if embarrassed by the admission, he turned back toward the garage. 8 o'clock. I'll have it ready." She came back at 10 minutes to 8 the next morning, riding in the passenger seat of Linda Perillo's 2009 Ford F-15. Oh, which smelled like dog hair and hay and had a religious medal hanging from the rearview mirror that Linda touched every time she changed lanes, which was often and without signaling. The Vanquish was sitting in the gravel lot exactly where she'd left it, except it was cleaner. Not just washed, really cleaned, the way someone cleans a thing they respect. The wheels were spotless. The glass was perfect. Even the tires had been dressed. Ronan was standing in the bay door with a mug of coffee, watching her walk across the lot. He was wearing the same gray shirt, or maybe a different gray shirt that was equally worn, and his face had the particular look of someone who had been up very late and gotten up very early and was running on caffeine and the particular satisfaction of a job done right. "It's ready," he said. Celine walked to the car, opened the door, and got in. She turned the key. The engine started, and she knew immediately. It was different, not just fixed, not just the absence of the hesitation she'd been chasing for 6 weeks. The engine sounded, she didn't have the right word for it, alive. Like it had been slightly asleep before, operating at 98% of itself, and now it was fully awake. The throttle response was instantaneous. The idle was silk. When she blipped the accelerator, the engine rose with a precision that made her exhale through her nose in a way that was almost a laugh. She sat there for a full minute, just listening. Then she got out. "What did you do?" she said. "What I said I'd do. Pulled the ECU, found the cold joint, reflowed it, recalibrated." He took a sip of coffee. "I also adjusted your idle air control, which was about 4% rich, probably happened during one of the other shop's diagnostic cycles. And I cleaned your throttle bodies because they needed it." "I didn't ask you to do any of that." "You didn't need to. The car needed it." She stared at him. "How much?" $450. $450. That's what I said. I paid Whitfield Motorworks $11,000, and they couldn't even find the problem. Ronan shrugged. "I didn't charge for finding the problem. I charged for fixing it. And the cleaning and adjustment, I just did because it was there." Celine opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. She was not used to being at a loss for words. It was not a sensation she enjoyed, and yet here she was, standing on a gravel lot in Millbrook, Connecticut, feeling genuinely unsure of what to say to a man who had done exactly what he said he would do, done it better than anyone she'd ever encountered, and was now charging her less than her monthly dry cleaning bill. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. "I'm transferring you $2,000. The price is $450. The value of what you just did is considerably more than $450. "The price is $450, he said again. "I charge what the work is worth. The work was worth $450. "By what possible calculation? 6 hours of labor at $60 an hour is $360. Parts were negligible, just solder and cleaning solvent. Call it $90 for the wash and detail because I had Lila help with that, and she charges $10 an hour, which she will remind me about if I forget." A faint smile. "She keeps a ledger." Celine looked at him for a long time. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious about what things cost." He finished his coffee. "You can pay cash or check. I don't take cards." She wrote him a check for $450. It felt, in a way she couldn't explain, like the most expensive transaction she'd ever been part of. Not because of the money, but because of what the money represented. She was paying for competence so far beyond what she'd encountered anywhere else that it redefined her understanding of what competence meant. She got in the car. The engine was still running, still perfect, still that gorgeous, precise, fully awake sound that made her want to drive for hours just to listen to it. "Ronan," he looked at her through the open window. "Who are you?" The question came out before she could think about whether she actually wanted to ask it or hear the answer. It was too direct, too personal, too much like an admission that she didn't understand something, which was a thing Celine Ashbourne almost never admitted. He stood there with his empty coffee mug and his stained shirt and his tired eyes and said, "I'm a mechanic in Millbrook." Then he turned and walked back into the garage, and the radio came on again. That old rock station, something with a guitar. And he slid back under the sedan on the lift, and Celine sat in her running car and watched his legs disappear beneath the chassis and thought, for the first time in years, that she had encountered a person she couldn't categorize. She drove home. The car was magnificent. Well, she told Marcus Whitehall first. Marcus was a collector, not the kind who bought cars as investments and kept them in climate-controlled vaults, but the kind who actually drove them, who showed up to weekend rallies with bugs on his headlights and gravel dust in his wheel wells. He owned a 1967 DB6 that had been giving him intermittent oil pressure readings for months, and he'd been to 3 shops without resolution. "You're telling me a guy in a shed in Connecticut diagnosed your car by listening to it," Marcus said over dinner at Celine's club in Hartford. He was cutting into a steak with the methodical precision of a man who approached everything, food, cars, real estate, as a problem to be optimized. "It's not a shed, it's a cinderblock garage." That makes it sound worse. He fixed a problem that your friends at Morrison couldn't find with $200,000 worth of diagnostic equipment. Fixed it in 6 hours. Charged me $450. Marcus put down his knife. $450. I offered him more. He refused. That's either insane or a very good marketing strategy. It's neither. That's what he charges. Marcus looked at her with the expression of a man who had made his money by being skeptical of anything that sounded too good to be true. "Give me his number." She gave him Ronan's number. Marcus called the next day, drove out to Millbrook the day after that, and called Celine that evening from his car. "Celine, how's the DB6? "The DB6 is, I don't have words. The oil pressure thing was a partially blocked gallery that 3 shops missed because they were looking at the sensor and the pump and never actually checked the gallery itself. He found it in 20 minutes. But that's not why I'm calling." "Why are you calling?" "Because while he was working on my car, I saw what else was in that garage. He's got a workbench with hand tools that I swear are museum pieces. And he was talking to my car, not in a crazy way, in the way you'd talk to an animal you were trying to calm down. And his kid was there, doing homework at a folding table next to a parts washer, and she asked me if I wanted lemonade, and when I said yes, she charged me $2. Celine laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Who is this guy?" Marcus said. "A mechanic in Millbrook. That's what he told me." "Yeah, well, that's like saying Yo-Yo Ma is a guy who plays the cello." Marcus told Diane Feldstein. Diane told 3 people. 2 of those people told 4 more. Within a week, Celine's phone was buzzing with calls from collectors she knew, and several she didn't, asking for the address of a garage in Millbrook that nobody could find on any map of authorized service providers. The cars started arriving. Not all at once, not in a flood, but in a steady trickle that became a stream. A 1964 DB5 from Boston with a transmission problem that the owner had been chasing for 2 years. A Vantage 5.8 from Philadelphia with an electrical gremlin that defied diagnosis. A 177 from a Manhattan hedge fund manager who wouldn't trust anyone else with a car valued at over $2 million, until Marcus Whitehall told him about the mechanic in Millbrook, who talked to engines and charged $450. Ronan fixed them all. Every single one. Not with computers or diagnostic software or the latest equipment, but with his hands and his ears and a knowledge so deep and instinctive it seemed less like expertise than like fluency. The difference between someone who'd studied a language in a classroom and someone who'd grown up speaking it at the dinner table. And he charged what the work was worth, never more. Never what the market would bear, never what the clients could obviously afford, never a penny above what he calculated the labor and parts justified. The hedge fund manager tried to leave a $10,000 tip. Ronan mailed it back with a handwritten note that said, "Price is on the invoice. Thanks for the business." Celine heard about that from the hedge fund manager himself, who told her the story with the bewildered admiration of a man who couldn't decide whether Ronan was the most principled person he'd ever met or the worst businessman. "Both," Celine said. "I think it's both." She was curious now, more than curious. She was preoccupied. In her world, people did things for reasons. They positioned themselves. They built brands. They cultivated relationships with an eye toward leverage and return. Ronan did none of this. He fixed cars because he was extraordinarily good at fixing cars. And he charged what was fair, and he went home to his daughter, and that appeared to be the entire story. Except Celine didn't believe in entire stories. There was always something underneath, a history, a motivation, A wound. People didn't end up in places like Millbrook by accident, especially not people with abilities like Ronan's. She started looking into it, not aggressively. She wasn't investigating him. She was just curious. She mentioned his name to a few people in the automotive world, the kind of people who kept track of who was who in restoration and engineering circles. And what came back surprised her. Ronan Ellsworth had been one of the most talented Aston Martin restoration engineers in the world. Not in Millbrook, not in Connecticut. In the world. He'd worked for a firm in England, Pemberton Coachworks, one of the most respected names in heritage automotive restoration, and had been, by all accounts, a prodigy. He could diagnose problems by sound that other engineers needed weeks and thousands of dollars in equipment to identify. He understood the architecture of Aston Martin engines, every generation, every variant, every quirk, with a comprehensiveness that people described using words like intuitive and almost unsettling. He'd been 26 when he joined Pemberton. By 28, he was leading their most complex restorations. And then, at 30, he'd left, walked away, came back to the States, bought a cinderblock garage in a town nobody had heard of, and disappeared from the industry entirely. The people Celine talked to were vague about why. Personal reasons, one said. Family stuff, said another. Nobody knew the details, or if they did, they weren't sharing. What they all agreed on was that his departure had been a loss. The kind of loss an industry feels quietly, the way you feel the absence of a sound you didn't realize you were hearing until it stopped. She drove out to Millbrook again on a Thursday afternoon, telling herself it was because she wanted him to check the Vanquish's suspension calibration. That was technically true. It was also true that she could have had any of a dozen mechanics do it closer to home. Lila was on the porch when she pulled up, reading a book that was significantly thicker than anything Celine remembered reading at 9. The girl looked up, recognized the car, and waved. "Hey, you came back. Dad said you probably would." "He did?" "He said you'd find a reason. He says people always find a reason once they know the car will actually get fixed right." Celine walked across the gravel. "What are you reading?" Lila held up the book. It was about marine biology. "I want to study octopuses. Did you know they have 3 hearts? That's so extra." "That is pretty extra." "Are you rich?" The question was delivered with the same casual directness as the observation about octopuses. No malice, no strategy, just genuine curiosity from a person who hadn't yet learned that some questions made adults uncomfortable. "Yes," Celine said. "Cool. My dad isn't rich. He says we have enough, which is what parents say when they don't have a lot, but they don't want you to worry about it." She closed her book. "He's in the garage. Mrs. Peterson's Buick is being dramatic again." Celine found Ronan under the Buick, which was indeed being dramatic, making a sound that even she could identify as deeply wrong. He slid out on the creeper when he heard her footsteps and looked up at her with grease on his chin and that same tired patience in his eyes. "Suspension?" he said. "How did you know?" "Because the car's fine and you're looking for a reason to come back." "Your daughter said the same thing. She's smarter than me. What's the real reason you're here?" Celine leaned against the doorframe of the garage. The space was small and organized with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Every tool in its place, every surface clean despite the nature of the work, every shelf labeled in a neat, angular hand. On the wall above the workbench, she noticed a photograph she hadn't seen before. A young woman with dark hair and a wide smile, holding an infant wrapped in a yellow blanket. The photo was in a simple wooden frame, slightly faded, positioned where Ronan would see it every time he reached for a wrench. She looked at the photo, then at Ronan, and didn't ask. Some questions answered themselves. "I know who you are," she said instead. "Pemberton Coachworks. You were their best engineer." Something shifted in his face. Not anger, not defensiveness. Something quieter, a door closing softly. "That was a long time ago." "It was 6 years ago." "Like I said, a long time ago." "You were doing the most prestigious restoration work in the world. You could have named your price at any firm on the planet. And you walked away to open a one-bay garage in a town that doesn't have a traffic light." Ronan stood up slowly, wiped his hands on the rag, and looked at her with an expression that she would later describe to herself as careful. Not guarded. Careful. The expression of a man who was choosing his words not because he was hiding something, but because the truth was heavy and he wanted to set it down gently. "My wife got sick," he said. "Claire. She was diagnosed 2 months after Lila was born. I had a 3-month-old daughter and a wife who was dying and a job 8 time zones away." He folded the rag precisely, matching the edges. There wasn't a decision to make. There was just what you do. You came home. I came home. I took care of Claire. I took care of Lila. And when Claire died, I stayed, because Lila needed a parent who was present, not one who was in a shop in England 10 months out of the year being brilliant at something that didn't matter as much as she did. The way he said it, without self-pity, without bitterness, without any of the emotional ornamentation that people usually wrapped around stories of loss, made Celine's throat tighten in a way she didn't expect and didn't appreciate. She didn't do well with vulnerability, in herself or in others. It made her feel exposed, as if someone had opened a window she'd spent years sealing shut. "You could have gone to any firm here. There are shops in New York and Boston. I could have. I didn't want to. I wanted a place where Lila could ride her bike to school and do her homework in the garage and know that I'd be there every day at 3:15 when the bus dropped her off. I wanted a place where the work came to me, not the other way around. And this?" He gestured at the garage, the cinder blocks, the old lift, the cluttered workbench. "This is enough. This is exactly enough." Celine stood there in the doorway of a garage that smelled like motor oil and solvent and old concrete, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she was looking at a man who had made a choice that most people in her world would consider incomprehensible. He had talent that could have made him wealthy and famous. He had walked away from it without hesitation, without regret, without looking back, because there was something he valued more than wealth and fame, and that something was currently on the front porch reading about octopuses and charging visitors $2 for lemonade. "I should go," she said. "The suspension is fine. I know the suspension is fine. I'll come back when something actually breaks." "You don't need to wait for something to break." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them that wasn't romantic and wasn't professional and wasn't anything she had a category for. Just a recognition, maybe. The sense of seeing someone clearly and being seen clearly in return. She drove home. The car was still perfect. Odd. Ronan didn't hear about it until the second week. The cars kept coming. That was normal now, or what passed for normal. 2 or 3 a week, sometimes more, pulled into his gravel lot by people who dressed like Celine and talked like Celine, and assumed at first that he would be impressed by them, or their cars, or their money. He was never impressed. He was interested in the cars, and polite to the people, and that was sufficient. But the calls started getting strange. A collector in Virginia canceled an appointment, then one in New Jersey, then 2 in New York. The reasons were vague: schedule conflict, going with another shop, decided to wait. Ronan didn't think much of it. People changed their minds. That was their business. It was Marcus Whitehall who told him what was actually happening. Marcus showed up on a Tuesday afternoon with a bottle of bourbon and the expression of a man delivering bad news. He sat in one of the mismatched chairs on Ronan's porch. Lila was at a friend's house and poured 2 glasses and said, "Have you heard of Damien Cross?" Ronan took the glass. "Cross Automotive, big luxury dealership network, East Coast, authorized Aston Martins service center. He's losing clients, a lot of clients, and he knows exactly where they're going. Here. Marcus took a long drink. "He's not happy about it. And Damien Cross is the kind of man who, when he's not happy, makes sure other people aren't happy either." Ronan sat in his chair and looked at his garage in the fading light. The cinder blocks looked almost golden in the last of the sun, which was generous of the sun, because the cinder blocks were ugly in every other light. What's he doing? Right now? Asking questions? Calling around? He's got people looking into your background, where you worked, why you left, what happened at Pemberton. Marcus set down his glass. "I know what happened at Pemberton, Ronan, or at least I've heard the rumor." Ronan's face didn't change. "What rumor?" "That you didn't just leave, that there was a dispute, something about engineering standards, cutting corners, the company choosing profit over quality, and that you walked away rather than sign off on work you didn't believe in." That's not a rumor." That's what happened. I know, but here's the thing. If Damien Cross gets hold of that story and decides to spin it, he's not going to tell it the way I just told it. He's going to tell it as disgraced engineer forced out of the industry. He's going to leave out the part about the standards and the integrity and add in whatever makes you look worst. Ronan took a sip of bourbon. It was good bourbon. Marcus always brought good bourbon. Let him. Ronan, I said let him. I don't have a reputation to protect. I have a garage and a kid and a list of cars that need work. If somebody wants to believe whatever story Damien Cross tells about me, they can believe it. The cars will still need fixing, and I'll still be the one who can fix them. Marcus looked at him with something between admiration and frustration. You know, most people, when someone threatens to destroy their livelihood, they fight back. Most people have more to lose than I do, or they think they do. Ronan finished his bourbon. I appreciate you telling me. I mean that. But I've been through worse than a car dealer with a grudge, and I'm still here. Marcus left. The sun went down. Ronan sat on the porch for a while after that, in the dark, listening to the sounds of the town settling into evening. A dog somewhere, a car on the main road, the hum of crickets starting up like a symphony tuning its instruments. Lila would be home in an hour. He'd make her dinner. Pasta, probably, because she was on a pasta kick this week, and the week before it had been tacos, and the week before that it had been breakfast for dinner every night, which had nearly killed him, because a man can only cook so many scrambled eggs before he starts to question his life choices. He thought about Claire. He thought about her the way he always did, not as a memory to be revisited, but as a presence that had never fully left. A voice in his ear, a hand on his shoulder, a way of looking at problems that was gentler and more forgiving than his own. She would have known what to do about Damien Cross. She always knew what to do about people. That had been her gift, understanding what made people work the way an engine worked, knowing where the friction was, knowing what needed adjusting. He missed her. He always missed her, not with the raw, consuming grief of the first year, but with a steady ache that had become so familiar it was almost indistinguishable from the rest of him. Like a sound you've been hearing so long, you don't notice it anymore. Except sometimes, in the quiet, you do. He went inside. He made pasta. Lila came home full of stories about her friend's new hamster, which had apparently escaped its cage and been found inside a shoe. She ate 2 plates of penne and talked without pausing for breath, and then fell asleep on the couch with her marine biology book open on her chest, and Ronan carried her to bed and tucked her in and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, just looking at her. This was enough. This was everything. Whatever Damien Cross was planning, whatever was coming, Ronan had survived worse. He had survived the worst thing a person can survive and come out the other side with a daughter who charged people for lemonade and a garage that smelled like motor oil, and a life that was small and ordinary and exactly, precisely right. He closed Lila's door and went to bed. The house was quiet. The garage was dark. Outside, the stars were thick above Millbrook, the way they always were in towns without enough light to drown them out, and the night settled over the little white house and the cinder-block garage like a blanket someone had pulled up gently, carefully, the way you cover a child who's already asleep. The first article appeared on a Wednesday morning, buried in an automotive industry blog that Celine wouldn't have noticed if Marcus Whitehall hadn't texted her the link at 6:15 in the morning with a single word, started. She read it in bed, her coffee going cold on the nightstand. The headline was carefully worded. Not libelous, not quite, but close enough to do damage. Former Pemberton engineer's quiet exit raises questions about industry standards. The piece was short, maybe 500 words, and it didn't accuse Ronan of anything directly. It didn't have to. It used phrases like abrupt departure and unresolved concerns and sources familiar with the situation suggest. And it painted a picture of a man who had left a prestigious firm under a cloud of ambiguity, the kind of ambiguity that readers could fill in with whatever suspicions they brought to the table. There was no byline. The blog was one of those industry-adjacent outlets that survived on advertising revenue from dealership networks and luxury service centers, the kind of publication that would run whatever its sponsors wanted as long as it was dressed up to look like journalism. Celine didn't need to check who the primary advertiser was. She already knew. She called Ronan at 7, He picked up on the fourth ring, and she could hear Lila in the background arguing with someone, possibly the toaster, about the appropriate darkness level for bread. "Have you seen it?" Celine said. "Seen what?" "There's an article online about you and Pemberton." A pause, then the sound of a cabinet closing. "What does it say?" "Nothing specific, that's the point. It implies things without stating them. It makes you sound like you were forced out." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him breathing, could hear the shift in the quality of the silence, the way a room sounds different when someone in it has just received news they were expecting but hoping wouldn't come. "Okay," he said. "Okay? That's it? What would you like me to say?" "I'd like you to say you're going to do something about it. Call a lawyer. Issue a statement, something." "Celine, I fix cars. I don't issue statements." "Ronan, I appreciate the call. I do. But I've got a 71 DBS that needs its carburetors rebuilt, and Lila's bus comes in 40 minutes, and I burned the toast. I have to go." He hung up. Celine sat in her bed with her dead phone and her cold coffee and felt a frustration so specific it was almost its own emotion. The frustration of watching someone refuse to protect themselves, not out of ignorance, but out of a deliberate, maddening, principled refusal to engage with the ugliness of other people's intentions. She got dressed and went to work and spent the morning in meetings she didn't care about, and then she canceled her afternoon and did what she did better than almost anyone. She started pulling threads. Damien Cross was not a complicated man. He was, by most accounts, a successful one. 3 luxury dealerships across the Northeast, an authorized Aston Martins service center that handled warranty work and high-end restorations, a client list that read like a registry of East Coast wealth. He wore custom suits and drove a different car every week and donated conspicuously to charities that put his name on things. He was the kind of man who measured his worth by the visible markers of success and became genuinely confused and then genuinely angry when those markers were threatened. And they were being threatened. Celine made some calls, talked to some people, did some math. In the 8 weeks since word had started spreading about Ronan's garage, Cross Automotive's high-end service division had lost roughly 30% of its Aston Martin clientele. Not all of them had gone to Ronan. Some had simply used the exodus as an opportunity to try other shops. But enough had that the trend was unmistakable. Damien Cross was hemorrhaging the clients who mattered most. The collectors, the enthusiasts, the people who owned cars worth more than most houses and who talked to each other constantly about where to take them. Celine understood this because she understood business. She understood the dynamics of reputation and referral and the particular vulnerability of any enterprise built on prestige rather than price. Damien Cross wasn't losing clients because Ronan was cheaper, although he was, absurdly so. He was losing them because Ronan was better. And in the world of high-end automotive work, better was a verdict that, once delivered, was almost impossible to reverse. What she couldn't understand, what gnawed at her in the way that unsolved problems always did, was why Ronan wouldn't fight back. Not because he was weak. She'd spent enough time around him to know that weakness wasn't part of his vocabulary. But because he seemed to genuinely not care about what Damien Cross or anyone else thought of him, and that kind of indifference, in Celine's experience, was either very rare or very dangerous, and she wasn't sure which. She drove out to Millbrook the following Saturday. She told herself it was because she wanted to check on the car. The car was fine, and she knew the car was fine, and Ronan knew she knew the car was fine, but neither of them mentioned it. She found him in the garage, bent over the engine bay of a 1964 DB5 that had arrived from Boston earlier that week. The car was magnificent, even in its disassembled state. The body lines, the proportions, the particular shade of silver birch that Aston Martin had used in that era. Ronan had the valve covers off and was inspecting the head gasket surfaces with a magnifying loupe, turning his head slowly, reading the metal the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Lila was at her usual post, the folding table next to the parts washer, which had been upgraded since Celine's first visit to include a desk lamp and a small shelf for books. She was drawing something in a sketchbook, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in concentration. "Hey," Lila said without looking up, "there's lemonade in the cooler, $2, or $3 if you want the kind with mint. I'm testing premium pricing." I'll take the mint, Celine said. Smart choice. That's the growth market. Celine poured herself a cup from the cooler, a battered Coleman that had clearly been on many camping trips, and walked over to where Ronan was working. He glanced up, nodded, and went back to the engine. More cancellations? She asked. 2 this week. A Virage from Connecticut and a V8 from White Plains. Did they say why? The Virage said he was going back to his regular shop. The V8 said he'd read some things and wanted to be cautious. Ronan set down the loop. Being cautious with a V8 Vantage. The man was driving a car that does 170 miles an hour, and he wanted to be cautious about who turns a wrench on it. You're not angry. I'm a little angry. I'm not going to do anything stupid about it. But yeah, I'm angry. These are people's cars. These are serious machines. And some of them are going to go to shops that are going to do mediocre work because a guy with a grudge wrote a nasty blog post. He picked up a gasket scraper and started cleaning the head surface with short, precise strokes. That bothers me. Not the part about me, the part about the cars. Of course it does, Celine said, and she meant it. And the fact that she meant it surprised her slightly because she was not generally a person who understood caring about things more than about yourself. She watched him work for a while. His hands moved with a deliberateness that she found almost hypnotic. Each motion considered, each action taken with full attention, nothing wasted. He never rushed. He never hesitated. He simply did the next right thing, and then the next, and then the next. And the cumulative effect was something that looked less like manual labor and more like a performance of some kind. Not theatrical, not showy, but precise in the way that any mastered craft becomes precise when you've done it long enough that the conscious mind steps back and lets the body work. I've been looking into Damien Cross, she said. Ronan didn't stop working. I figured you might. He's behind the article. He's also behind the cancellations. He's calling your clients directly, telling them he's heard things, expressing concern. Very tasteful. Very deniable. He's scared. He's terrified. You're costing him real money, Ronan, not just revenue, reputation. His whole business model is built on being the best, on being the place where serious collectors bring serious cars. And now there's a guy in a cinderblock garage who's better than him for a fraction of the cost, and he doesn't know how to compete with that because you can't compete with it. You can only try to destroy it. Ronan set down the scraper and looked at her. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm telling you what's happening so you can make an informed decision about how to respond. I told you how I respond. I fix cars. I go home to my kid. That's my response. And if he escalates, then he escalates. And if he tries to shut you down, goes after your permits, your insurance, then I deal with it, the way I deal with everything, one thing at a time. Celine felt that frustration again. The specific, pointed, almost admiring frustration of watching a man stand in the path of an oncoming train and refuse to move. Not because he didn't see it, but because he believed the track he was standing on was the right place to be. You know, she said, in my world, when someone attacks you, you attack back. You hire lawyers. You go to the press. You fight. Your world sounds exhausting. She almost laughed. It is exhausting, but it works. Does it? He looked at her steadily. You've been fighting your whole life. Are you happy? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Simple, direct, and radiating outward into places she didn't want to examine. She didn't answer, because the honest answer was complicated, and the dishonest answer was beneath her, and so she just stood there with her $3 mint lemonade and watched him go back to work and thought about how strange it was that a man who couldn't afford health insurance could see things about her that her therapist charged $300 an hour to miss. I'm going to look into this more, she said finally, whether you want me to or not. I can't stop you. No, you can't. Just, Celine. He stopped working and turned to face her fully, and his eyes were serious in a way she hadn't seen before. Whatever you find, whatever you do with it, don't do it for me. I didn't ask for this, and I don't want it. If you're going to do something, do it because it's right. Not because you feel sorry for me, or because you want to fix me, or because you've decided I'm some kind of project. I'm not a project. I know you're not a project. He oscillated. Do you? Because in my experience, people with resources look at people without resources and see something that needs improving. And I don't need improving. He gestured around the garage again, the way he had before, taking in the old lift and the cluttered bench and the photograph of Claire on the wall. This is not a situation I need to be rescued from. This is my life, and I chose it. They looked at each other for a moment that stretched past comfortable and into something raw. The kind of moment where two people with very different lives and very different worldviews recognized that the distance between them was both vast and in some fundamental way irrelevant. Understood, Celine said quietly. She finished her lemonade, paid Lila, who gave her a handwritten receipt on a piece of notebook paper, and drove home. The car ran perfectly. She barely noticed. That evening, she sat in her study in her Hartford penthouse with her laptop open and a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, and began the kind of work she was very, very good at: the patient, systematic, methodical disassembly of a lie. It took her 3 days. The story of Ronan's departure from Pemberton Coachworks wasn't hard to find once you knew where to look and whom to ask. The hard part wasn't the facts. The facts were surprisingly straightforward. The hard part was getting people to talk, because the people who knew the truth had spent 6 years not talking about it, some out of loyalty to Ronan and some out of fear of the company, and some out of the simple human tendency to avoid conflict when staying quiet was easier. But Celine Ashbourne was not a woman people found easy to refuse. She had the particular combination of intelligence, persistence, and social authority that made stonewalling her feel less like a strategy and more like a delay of the inevitable. She made calls. She flew to London for a day and had lunch with a former Pemberton engineer who'd left the firm a year after Ronan. She spoke to Ronan's old supervisor, now retired, who talked for 2 hours once he started and couldn't seem to stop. She obtained internal emails, not through anything illegal, just through the professional network of a woman who had spent 15 years building the kind of relationships that made information flow toward her naturally, like water finding its level. The story was this. Pemberton Coachworks, in the year before Ronan's departure, had begun cutting corners on restoration work to improve profit margins. Not dramatically, not dangerously, not at first. Small things, substituting less expensive materials in places where clients wouldn't notice, reducing the hours allocated for quality testing, approving work that met minimum standards rather than the standards the firm's reputation was built on. The pressure came from the top, from new ownership that had acquired Pemberton, not because they loved cars, but because they loved margins, and who saw the firm's obsession with quality as an inefficiency to be optimized. Ronan had objected, formally, in writing, to his supervisors and then to the ownership group. He had documented specific instances where he believed the compromises endangered the integrity of the restorations and, by extension, the safety of the vehicles. He had refused to sign off on 3 separate projects that he felt did not meet the standards he'd been hired to maintain. The response had been predictable. Not firing, they couldn't fire him, not with his record, not without cause, but pressure, subtle at first, then less subtle. Reassignment to less prestigious projects. Reduction in his team's resources. The particular kind of institutional hostility that doesn't leave fingerprints but makes every day feel like walking through mud. And then Claire got sick. Celine read the timeline 3 times to make sure she had it right. Claire Ellsworth had been diagnosed in March. Lila had been 3 months old. Ronan had been fighting a battle on 2 fronts, one at work and one at home. And the home front was the one that mattered. He'd submitted his resignation in April with a letter that was exactly 1 sentence long. I resign effective immediately for personal reasons. No fight, no public statement, no legal action, no attempt to hold Pemberton accountable for the compromises he'd documented. He'd simply walked away. From the career, from the fight, from everything that wasn't Claire and Lila. Because he didn't have the strength for a war on 2 fronts, and he'd chosen the only front that mattered. Celine sat at her desk with the timeline spread out in front of her and felt something she rarely felt. Genuine, uncomplicated admiration for another human being. Not the kind of admiration she felt for dealmakers and strategists and people who won. The kind of admiration you feel for someone who could have won and chose not to play, because winning wasn't the point. She closed her laptop. She poured the untouched wine down the sink. She went to bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man in a faded gray shirt who had been right about everything and asked for nothing, not even justice, because justice required time and energy and attention that he'd given instead to a dying wife and a motherless daughter. In the morning, she called her lawyer. "I need you to put together a file," she said. "Everything I have on Pemberton Coachworks and a former employee named Ronan Ellsworth, and I need you to find out exactly what Damian Cross has been doing, who he's talked to, what he said, whether any of it crosses the line into defamation. And I need it fast." "How fast?" "This week." "Celine, that's this week, Jonathan. Bill me whatever you want. This week." She hung up and got dressed and went to work and spent the day doing the things that billionaires do. Taking calls, making decisions, moving money from one place to another in ways that created value for people who already had more value than they knew what to do with. And the whole time, underneath the meetings and the spreadsheets and the conference calls, she was thinking about a garage in Millbrook and a photograph on a wall and a man who had told her, with a total absence of self-pity, that his wife had died and he had stayed, and that was the whole story. Except it wasn't the whole story. Not anymore. Because now Damian Cross was trying to turn it into a different story. A story about disgrace and failure and the kind of professional ruin that follows you like a smell. And Celine Ashbourne was not going to let that happen. Not because Ronan had asked her to. He hadn't. He wouldn't. That was precisely the point. She was going to do it because it was right. Because a man who sacrificed his career to maintain his integrity and then sacrificed his ambition to raise his daughter did not deserve to have his reputation destroyed by a mediocre businessman with a bruised ego. Because the truth was simple and clear and sitting right there in the documents and the emails and the testimony of people who had watched Ronan Ellsworth do the hardest thing a person can do, give up everything he was good at for someone he loved. And the fact that no one had told that truth yet was an injustice that Celine felt in her chest like a weight. She didn't call Ronan. She didn't drive out to Millbrook. She didn't tell him what she was doing because she knew what he'd say. Don't. It's not worth it. Leave it alone. And he'd be wrong. He'd be wrong the way good people are often wrong about what they deserve, confusing what they need with what they're willing to accept, mistaking endurance for a strategy when it was really just a habit learned from years of having no other choice. 2 more articles appeared that week. One on the same blog, one on a regional automotive news site that Celine had never heard of. Both used the same careful, deniable language. Both implied without stating. Both left readers to draw their own conclusions, which were, inevitably, the wrong ones. And then, on Friday evening, Ronan called her. His voice was different, not panicked. Ronan didn't panic, she was increasingly sure of that, but tight. Controlled in the way a voice gets when the person speaking is working very hard to keep something contained. "Someone broke into the garage," he said. Celine sat up straight. "When?" "Last night, probably. I didn't notice until this morning because they didn't take anything. They just made a mess. Knocked tools off the bench, poured oil on the floor, spray painted something on the bay door." "What did they spray paint?" A pause. It said fraud. The word sat between them like something solid and ugly. "Where's Lila?" Celine asked. "At school. She hasn't seen it. I cleaned the door before she got up." "You cleaned it." "I painted over it. The door needed painting anyway." "Ronan, someone vandalized your garage. That's a crime. Have you called the police?" "And told them what? That somebody spray painted a word on my door? In a town where the police department is 2 guys and a dispatcher? They'll file a report and nothing will happen." "You don't know it was Cross." "I don't know it was Tuesday, but here we are." Something about this joke, the dark, exhausted humor of a man who was handling this the only way he knew how, by absorbing it and moving on, made Celine's resolve harden into something that felt almost physical. A decision, made not in her head, but in her bones. "I'm coming out there tomorrow," she said. "You don't need to... I'm coming out there tomorrow, and I'm bringing my lawyer, and we're going to talk about what happens next. Not because you asked me to, because I'm choosing to. And you told me not to rescue you, and I'm not rescuing you. I'm doing what's right. Those are your words, not mine." Silence on the line. She could hear him breathing. She could hear faintly the sound of the radio in the garage. That old rock station, still playing, always playing, as if nothing had happened. "Okay," he said finally. "But tell your lawyer I don't have coffee cups that match." "He'll survive." She hung up. She sat in her study for a long time after that, in the dark, with her phone in her hand and the city lights of Hartford spread out below her windows like a circuit board. Somewhere out there, in a town without a traffic light, a man who deserved better than this was painting over the word fraud on his garage door so his daughter wouldn't see it in the morning. And somewhere else, a man in a custom suit was sitting in a corner office feeling satisfied with himself, convinced that the best way to handle competition was to destroy it. Celine had spent her career in rooms full of powerful people making consequential decisions, and she had learned that the distance between right and wrong was usually smaller than people pretended. Most decisions lived in the gray space. Most choices involved trade-offs that made moral clarity a luxury. But this wasn't gray. This was as clear as anything she'd ever seen. A good man was being hurt by a petty one, and the good man was too stubborn or too proud or too decent to fight back. And the petty one was counting on exactly that. She picked up her phone and called Jonathan back. "Change of plans," she said. "I don't just need the file, I need a strategy, and I need it by tomorrow morning." Tomorrow is Saturday. "I know what day tomorrow is. Celine, Jonathan, please." He sighed the sigh of a man who had been Celine Ashbourne's lawyer for 12 years and had long since stopped being surprised by anything she asked. "I'll have something for you by 9. "Thank you." She hung up. She went to the window and looked out at the city and thought about Ronan, alone in his painted-over garage, making pasta for his daughter, listening to that old radio, refusing to be broken by a world that kept testing whether he could be. Tomorrow, she would go to Millbrook. She would bring her lawyer and her evidence and her plan, and she would sit across from Ronan Ellsworth in his mismatched porch chairs and tell him the truth about what had been done to him. And then she would ask him to let her help, not because he needed rescuing, but because some fights were too important to sit out, and some truths were too heavy for one person to carry alone. Whether he'd agree was another question entirely. But Celine Ashbourne had not become a billionaire by accepting no for an answer, and she was not about to start now. Not for Damien Cross, not for the industry, and especially not for the quiet, stubborn, infuriatingly principled man in the gray work shirt who had fixed her car and, without meaning to, broken something open inside her that she'd spent years keeping shut. Jonathan arrived in Millbrook 15 minutes before Celine did, which meant he'd been sitting in his silver Mercedes in front of Ronan's garage long enough to attract Lila's attention. By the time Celine pulled up on Saturday morning, her lawyer, a man who billed at $900 an hour and owned 3 houses, was sitting on the porch steps drinking lemonade from a paper cup, while a 9-year-old explained to him the differences between the Pacific giant octopus and the blue-ringed octopus, which she described as tiny but absolutely lethal, like a pop quiz. "She charged me $4, Jonathan said when Celine walked up. "Apparently there's a weekend surcharge." "Supply and demand," Lila said, not looking up from her sketchbook. "Dad's inside. He's been weird all morning." Ronan was in the garage, standing at his workbench with his back to the door, organizing wrenches that were already organized. It was the first time Celine had seen him doing something that served no purpose, and she recognized it immediately. The restless motion of a person preparing for a conversation they didn't want to have. "Ronan," she said. He turned around. He looked tired, but it was a different kind of tired than usual. Not the chronic, low-grade exhaustion of a single parent running a business, but the sharper fatigue of a man who had spent the night thinking about something he'd been trying not to think about for 6 years. "Your lawyer's drinking my daughter's lemonade," he said. "He seems to be enjoying it." "She's charging him weekend rates." "I heard." Celine leaned against the workbench beside him. "Can we talk?" "We are talking." "I mean about Pemberton, about what really happened, about why you left." Ronan set down the wrench he'd been holding. He didn't look at her. He looked at the photograph on the wall. Claire, with Lila in her arms, smiling that wide smile that Celine had never seen in person and would never see in person, and that she somehow felt the absence of anyway, the way you feel the absence of warmth when you walk past a fireplace that's gone cold. "You already know what happened," he said. "I told you. Claire got sick. I came home." "That's half the story. I know the other half now." He was quiet for a moment. "How much do you know?" "I know about the cost-cutting at Pemberton. I know about the material substitutions and the reduced quality testing. I know you documented everything and reported it formally, and they responded by sidelining you. I know you refused to sign off on 3 restorations that didn't meet your standards. And I know that when Claire was diagnosed, you were already in a fight you couldn't win. Not because you were wrong, but because you were one person against an ownership group that cared more about quarterly returns than about the cars. Ronan turned away from the photograph and looked at her. His expression was hard to read. Not angry, not sad, but something layered and complicated. The expression of a man confronting a version of his own history that he'd packed away in a box and shoved to the back of a shelf and had no interest in unpacking. "So you know," he said. "I know. And I know that Damian Cross is using a distorted version of that story to make you look like the villain instead of the person who tried to do the right thing." "I wasn't trying to do the right thing. I was just doing the work the way the work was supposed to be done. There wasn't any heroism in it. The standards existed for a reason, and I followed them. That's not courage, that's just not being lazy. Most people would have signed off and kept their jobs. Most people didn't grow up with a father who rebuilt engines in the driveway and taught me that if you put your name on a piece of work, it better be work you'd stake your name on." He picked up the wrench again, turned it over in his hands without purpose. "My dad was a mechanic. Not the kind with a fancy shop. The kind with a garage door that stuck and a light that flickered and neighbors who brought their cars over on Saturday mornings because they couldn't afford a real shop. He fixed everything that came through that door like it was the most important car in the world, because to him it was, every single one. He sounds like you. He was better than me. He just never had the chance to prove it to anyone except the people on his street." Ronan put the wrench down. "When Pemberton started cutting corners, I wasn't thinking about ethics or industry standards or any of that. I was thinking about my dad, about what he'd say if he knew I was putting my name on work I wouldn't put his name on, and I couldn't do it. It was that simple." Jonathan appeared in the doorway of the garage, holding his lemonade cup and a leather briefcase that looked incongruous against the backdrop of grease-stained concrete and old tools. He had the careful expression of a man entering a room where something important was already happening. "Mr. Ellsworth," he said, "I'm Jonathan Calder, Celine's attorney. I apologize for the intrusion, but I think you should see what we've put together." They sat on the porch, Ronan in one of the mismatched chairs, Celine in the other, Jonathan standing because there wasn't a third chair, and he was too well bred to sit on the steps. Lila had been sent inside to watch something on the small television in the living room, though Celine suspected she was sitting just inside the screen door, listening. The girl had inherited her father's ability to pay attention to things other people assumed she wasn't tracking. Jonathan opened his briefcase and laid out what he'd assembled. Printed copies of the blog articles, a timeline of Ronan's cancellations cross-referenced with dates of Damian Cross's phone calls to those same clients, records of Cross Automotive's advertising relationship with the blogs that had published the pieces, and all, most damning, a series of emails between Cross and a freelance writer, obtained through sources Jonathan declined to specify, in which Cross had provided specific language he wanted used in the articles and had approved final drafts before publication. "He commissioned them," Celine said. "He didn't just inspire them or suggest them, he paid for them, wrote them, and approved them." Ronan looked at the papers spread across the arm of his chair. He didn't touch them. He read them the way he read engine components, carefully, thoroughly, without rushing to a conclusion. "This is defamation," Jonathan said. "Clear, documented, and actionable. The articles contain false implications about your professional record that have caused measurable harm to your business. The vandalism may or may not be connected. We can't prove that yet. But the pattern of harassment is clear. You have grounds for a lawsuit that, frankly, you would win." Ronan was quiet for a long time, long enough that a bird landed on the porch railing, looked at all of them with the polite indifference of a creature that had more important things to do, and flew away again. "I'm not suing anybody," Ronan said. Jonathan looked at Celine. Celine looked at Ronan. "Ronan," she said. "No. Listen to me." He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees. 6 years ago, I had a choice. I could have fought Pemberton. I had the documentation, I had the case, I had the evidence. And I didn't fight, because Claire was dying and Lila was a baby, and I had exactly enough energy to do one thing, and the one thing I chose was being a father. I don't regret that. I would make that choice again tomorrow. This is different. It's not different. It's the same choice in different clothes. If I sue Damian Cross, that becomes my life. Depositions, discovery, court dates, lawyers, stress. Months of it. Maybe years. And during all of that, Lila's dad isn't in the garage fixing cars. Lila's dad is in a conference room arguing about what a blog post implied. That's not who I want to be. That's not who she needs me to be. So you let him win, Celine said, and there was an edge in her voice she didn't bother hiding. He doesn't win. He just doesn't lose in the way you want him to. There's a difference. The difference is semantic. The difference is everything. Ronan sat back. Celine, I've got clients lined up for 6 weeks. The people who know my work know my work. The people who believe a blog post over their own experience were never going to be my clients anyway. And Damian Cross, what does he have? A dealership full of cars that other people's money paid for. A reputation built on advertising instead of ability. A business that needs him to tear down other people because he can't build anything worth a damn on his own. That's not winning. That's surviving. And barely. Jonathan cleared his throat. Mr. Ellsworth, I understand your position and I respect it. But there's something else to consider. The articles are still online. They're still being read. And they contain implications about your work at Pemberton that are verifiably false. Even if you choose not to sue, the truth of what happened there, that you left because you refused to compromise on quality, is a powerful counter-narrative. Celine has documented evidence, including testimony from your former colleagues, that paints a very different picture than the one Cross is promoting. What are you suggesting? Jonathan looked at Celine. This was her part. I want to go public with the truth, Celine said. Not through a lawsuit, through the facts. I want to publish the real story of what happened at Pemberton. Your documentation, your reports, the testimony of people who worked with you and know what kind of engineer you are. Not to attack Cross directly, but to set the record straight. Let people see both versions and decide for themselves. Ronan looked at her for a long time. And you think the truth will be enough? I think the truth is always enough. I just think it needs help getting out the door sometimes. He almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction of an inch and then it settled back. You're not going to let this go, are you? No. Even if I ask you to. Especially if you ask me to. He looked out at the garage, at the gravel lot, at the quiet street beyond. A truck rumbled past. Somewhere down the block, someone was mowing a lawn, the sound rising and falling like a distant engine being tested. Fine, he said, but I have conditions. Name them. 1. Lila doesn't appear in any of this, not her name, not her picture, nothing. She's 9 years old and she's not part of this story. Agreed. 2. I don't give interviews, I don't make statements, I don't go on camera. You can publish whatever facts you have, but my voice isn't in it. The work speaks for itself or it doesn't. That makes it harder. That's my condition. Celine looked at him. She could push. She was good at pushing. She could argue that his story was more compelling with his voice in it, that people needed to hear from him directly, that silence could be misread as guilt. All of that was true. But she also understood, looking at his face, that this was the line he'd drawn, and if she crossed it, she'd lose something she was only beginning to understand she valued, his trust. Agreed, she said. Anything else? 3. When this is over, however it ends, you don't come back here and try to turn my garage into something it isn't. No investment offers, no expansion plans, no, let me help you grow your business. This garage is what it is. I'm what I am. If that's not enough for the world can find another mechanic. Celine held his gaze. Agreed. They shook hands. His grip was rough and calloused and sure, and hers was smooth and practiced and equally sure. And for a moment, they were just two people making a deal on a porch in a small town, the way deals had been made for centuries before lawyers and contracts and $900 hourly rates, on a handshake and a word and the assumption, perhaps naive, but also perhaps the only thing that mattered, that the person across from you meant what they said. Jonathan packed up his briefcase. Lila emerged from this house. She had absolutely been listening and asked whether anyone wanted more lemonade, and Jonathan said yes, and Lila charged him $5 because, she explained, this was now a consultation lemonade and professional rates applied. Celine left Millbrook that afternoon with a plan forming in her head. Not a vague intention, but a specific, sequenced, carefully considered strategy. She knew how to do this. She'd built her career on knowing how to do this, taking information that other people had and assembling it into a narrative that moved people to action. The difference was that this time the narrative was true, and the person it was about hadn't asked for it, and the motivation wasn't profit, but something she didn't have a word for yet. She spent the next 10 days executing. She reached out to the former Pemberton engineers she'd already spoken to and asked whether they'd be willing to go on record. 3 of them said yes. 1, a man named Gerald Ashcroft, who had been Ronan's direct supervisor and who had retired in disgust 2 years after Ronan left, said he'd been waiting 6 years for someone to ask. "I should have spoken up when it happened," Gerald told her over the phone, his voice carrying the scratchy quality of a man in his 70s who had smoked for 30 years and regretted it. "I should have backed him publicly, but I had a pension coming and a wife who needed stability, and I took the coward's path, and I've been living with that ever since." "You can change that now," Celine said. "I intend to." She compiled the internal documents, the reports Ronan had filed, the responses he'd received, the timeline showing how his concerns had been systematically ignored, and then how he'd been marginalized after refusing to comply. She had Jonathan review everything for legal exposure, so nothing they were publishing was confidential in a way that created liability, since the documents had been created by Ronan himself and the testimony was voluntary. She chose where to publish carefully, not the industry blogs that Cross controlled, not a splashy mainstream outlet that would turn it into clickbait. She went to Catherine Park, a journalist she knew at a respected automotive magazine, the kind of publication that serious collectors actually read and trusted. Catherine was skeptical at first, the way good journalists always are. But when Celine laid out the documentation, Ronan's reports, the internal emails, Gerald Ashcroft's testimony, the direct connection between Cross and the smear articles, Catherine's skepticism turned into the quiet intensity of a reporter who knows she's sitting on a real story. "This is solid," Catherine said. "All of it." "I know." "And the mechanic, Ellsworth, he won't talk to me?" "He won't talk to anyone. He doesn't want attention. He just wants to fix cars and raise his kid." Catherine looked at her notes, at the documents, at the careful architecture of evidence that Celine had assembled. "That's actually the best part of the story, the fact that he doesn't want to tell it." The article ran on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the vandalism. It was thorough and measured and devastating, not in a sensational way, but in the quiet, methodical way that truth is devastating when it's been hidden long enough for the lie to get comfortable. Catherine had done her own additional reporting, tracked down 2 more former Pemberton employees who confirmed every detail of Ronan's account, and obtained a statement from Pemberton's current management acknowledging, in the careful, liability-conscious language of corporate communications, that operational changes during the period in question may not have fully aligned with the firm's historical standards. The article didn't mention Damien Cross by name. It didn't need to. Catherine had documented the connection between the smear articles and Cross Automotive's advertising relationships, and she'd included screenshots of the emails showing Cross's direct involvement in their creation and approval. The implication was unmistakable, and unlike the implications in Cross's articles, this one was supported by evidence. Celine read the finished piece on her phone in the parking structure beneath her office, sitting in the Vanquish with the engine off, and felt something settle inside her. Not satisfaction, exactly, but the specific relief of watching something crooked being straightened. The truth was out. Whatever happened next, the truth was out. She texted Ronan. "It's published." He replied 20 minutes later. "Lila got a 94 on her math test." She laughed. Actually laughed, out loud, alone in her car in a concrete parking structure. Because, of course, that was his response. Of course, the man whose reputation had just been publicly vindicated was thinking about his daughter's math test. Of course. The response was immediate and intense. The automotive collector community was small enough that news traveled fast and large enough that the impact was significant. Within 48 hours, the article had been shared across every major collector forum, every enthusiast group, every social media channel where people who cared about these things gathered to talk about them. Gerald Ashcroft gave a follow-up interview in which he described Ronan as The most talented and principled engineer I've worked with in 40 years. And that quote circulated with the velocity of something people had been wanting to say for a long time. The blog articles about Ronan were quietly taken down. No retractions, no apologies. They just disappeared. The way things disappear on the internet when the people who publish them realize they're now liabilities rather than assets. The blogs themselves continued to exist, but their credibility, never strong to begin with, had been effectively destroyed. Then came the invitation. It arrived in Ronan's mailbox, his actual, physical mailbox, the dented metal one at the end of his driveway, on a Friday afternoon. A thick cream envelope with embossed lettering. The Aston Martin Heritage Expo, held annually at a private estate in Virginia, was the most prestigious gathering of Aston Martin collectors and enthusiasts in the Western Hemisphere. Attendance was by invitation only. The waiting list was years long. Ronan had never been invited. He'd never asked to be. The expo existed in a world he'd deliberately left behind, a world of wealth and status and the particular kind of automotive culture that treated cars as assets rather than machines. He had no interest in it and no reason to go. Except that the invitation had come with a handwritten note from the expo's chairman, a man named Richard Cavendish, who had been collecting Aston Martins for 40 years and who had read Catherine's article and then called 6 people to confirm every word of it. The note said, "Mr. Ellsworth, your work precedes you. We would be honored by your presence. Bring your daughter, R. Cavendish." Ronan showed the invitation to Celine when she came out the following week. He was holding it the way you'd hold a letter from a distant relative, with curiosity and mild suspicion and the vague sense that responding would commit you to something you hadn't fully thought through. "You should go," Celine said. "I don't belong there. You belong there more than anyone who'll be in the room. I don't have a suit. I'll buy you a suit." "You will absolutely not buy me a suit." "Then borrow one, rent one. Wear the gray shirt for all I care. But go, take Lila. Let her see what her father's work means to people." Ronan looked at the invitation again. He turned it over in his hands the way he turned tools, thoughtfully, reading the object itself as much as what was written on it. The cream paper, the embossed lettering, the handwritten note from a man he'd never met who had taken the time to write his name and his daughter's name in careful blue ink. "Lila would like Virginia," he said quietly. "She's been wanting to see the ocean." "Virginia has plenty of ocean." "It's not really the ocean, it's the Chesapeake Bay." "Close enough for a 9-year-old. He looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Not a smile, not quite, but a softening of the careful, guarded expression he wore like the gray shirt, so habitually that she sometimes forgot it was there. "Okay," he said. "We'll go." Celine nodded. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The word "okay" from Ronan Ellsworth carried more weight than most people's speeches, and she had learned, slowly, imperfectly, with all the clumsiness of a person accustomed to controlling situations rather than participating in them, to let his silences speak for themselves. She drove home that evening through the Connecticut countryside, through towns that looked like Millbrook and towns that didn't, past fields where the early autumn light lay across the grass like something poured from a jar. And she thought about a man who was going to put on a suit, or not, and take his daughter to see the Chesapeake Bay and walk into a room full of the wealthiest car collectors in America, not because he wanted to impress them, but because a 9-year-old wanted to see the water. She thought about Claire, about the photograph on the wall, about what it must have been like to be dying and to know that the man beside you was giving up everything, his career, his reputation, his place in the world, to hold your hand and care for your child, and that he was doing it without resentment, without calculation, without any expectation of reward or recognition. She thought about her own life, about the penthouse in Hartford, and the meetings and the portfolio and the particular kind of success that looked impressive from a distance and felt, up close, like a very expensive form of loneliness. She had everything Ronan didn't have: money, status, influence, a name people recognized, and he had everything she didn't have, which was a purpose that had nothing to do with any of those things, and everything to do with the small, unglamorous, irreducibly human act of showing up every day for someone who needed you. She wasn't envious. That wasn't the right word. She was something closer to humbled, which was a sensation so unfamiliar to Celine Ashbourne that she almost didn't recognize it. She had spent her adult life being the smartest person in every room she entered, and now she was beginning to suspect that intelligence, her kind of intelligence, the kind that moved money and won arguments and built empires, was only one kind and not necessarily the most important kind, and that the man in the gray shirt had a kind she hadn't even known existed until she watched him listen to an engine and hear what no one else could hear. The road unwound ahead of her, and the Vanquish responded to every input with the precision and immediacy that Ronan had restored to it, and Celine drove through the gathering dusk with the windows down and the cool air carrying the smell of cut grass and turned earth, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was moving towards something instead of away from it. The suit was borrowed. Marcus Whitehall had dropped it off at the garage on a Wednesday evening, a navy blue 2-button that his tailor had adjusted from Marcus's measurements based on what Marcus described as educated guessing and a photo I took of Ronan when he wasn't looking. It fit him perfectly, which was somehow exactly right. The shoulders were slightly wide and the trousers needed a belt Ronan didn't own, and when he put it on the morning of the expo and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, Lila stood in the doorway and studied him with the critical focus of a child who had never seen her father in anything other than work clothes. "You look weird," she said. "Thank you." "Not bad weird, just weird. Like when a teacher wears jeans on Casual Friday and you realize they have legs." "I've always had legs." "Yeah, but now they're in suit pants. It's different." She tilted her head. "You need a tie." "I don't have a tie." "Mom had scarves. There's a box in the closet." Ronan looked at her. She looked back at him with that steady, unblinking gaze that she'd gotten from Claire. The gaze that said, "I know this is a thing and I'm saying it anyway because somebody needs to." She was 9 years old and she already understood that grief wasn't a room you left but a house you lived in, and that sometimes you opened doors in that house not because you were ready, but because the door was there and the moment was right. He went to the closet. The box was on the top shelf behind a stack of old blankets. He hadn't opened it in more than a year. Inside were Claire's scarves, 6 or 7 of them, folded carefully, still carrying a faint trace of the perfume she'd worn, something with jasmine in it that he'd smelled 10,000 times and could still identify in a crowded room if someone nearby was wearing it. He picked up a scarf, deep blue silk with a thin silver stripe, and held it for a moment. Lila appeared beside him, took it from his hands, folded it lengthwise, and looped it around his collar with a precision that suggested she'd been watching YouTube videos on the subject. "It's not really a tie," she said, adjusting the knot, "but it's better than nothing, and Mom would have liked it." "How do you know what Mom would have liked?" "Because she liked you. She'd like you in anything." Lila stepped back and assessed her work. "Okay, you look less weird now. You look like a person who fixes nice cars and also sometimes wears a suit." "That's exactly what I am." "I know. That's why it works." They drove to Virginia in Ronan's truck, a 2004 Ford F250 with rust on the wheel wells and a passenger seat that Lila had to boost herself into using the running board as a step. The drive was 5 hours, and Lila spent the first 2 reading, the middle hour asking questions about the Chesapeake Bay that Ronan couldn't answer, and the last 2 sleeping with her head against the window and her marine biology book open on her lap like a blanket. Ronan drove and thought about Claire. He thought about her more than usual today, which was saying something because he thought about her every day. But today was different. Today, he was leaving Millbrook, leaving the garage, the town, the careful perimeter of the life he'd built, and going into the world that he'd walked away from 6 years ago, the world of collectors and engineers and people who cared about Aston Martins the way he cared about Aston Martins, except they cared about them from the ownership side, and he cared about them from the inside out, from the combustion chambers and the crankshafts and the particular way a properly tuned engine settled into idle like a sleeping animal breathing. Claire would have told him to stop overthinking it. She would have said something dry and precise and exactly right, the way she always did, cutting through the fog of his anxiety with the efficiency of a woman who had no patience for unnecessary worry. He could almost hear her voice. "It's a car show, Ronan, not a firing squad. Put on the borrowed suit, take our daughter, look at the cars, come home." It's not that complicated. It wasn't that complicated. Except it was, because Ronan hadn't been in a room with more than 4 people in years, and the last time he'd attended anything resembling an industry event, He'd been 28 and employed and married, and the future had been a thing that existed. Now he was 32 and self-employed and widowed, and the future was whatever happened after he got Lila through 4th grade, which was as far ahead as he allowed himself to plan. The estate was called Thornfield. It sat on 300 acres in the Virginia Piedmont, a Georgian brick manor surrounded by rolling pastures and white fences, and the kind of landscaping that required a full-time staff to maintain. Cars were already lining the long gravel drive when Ronan pulled up, and not ordinary cars. He counted 4 DB5s, 3 DB6s, 2 V8 Vantages, a Lagonda, and something under a cover that, based on its proportions, was either a DB4 GT Zagato or the most expensive object within a 50-mile radius. Probably both. Lila woke up as the truck crunched to a stop on the gravel. She looked out the window, blinked, and said, "Whoa. Yeah. These are all Aston Martins? Most of them. They're like the car the lady drives, the shiny one. Some of these are worth a lot more than the shiny one." Lila pressed her face against the glass. "How much more?" "The one under the cover over there is probably worth somewhere between $5 and $8 million. She turned to him with wide eyes. "For a car?" "For that car, yeah. That's insane you could buy so many octopuses with that money." "I don't think you can buy octopuses." "You can if you have $8 million. You can do anything with $8 million. She unbuckled her seatbelt and climbed down from the truck with the energetic carelessness of a child for whom gravity was a suggestion rather than a law. "Come on, let's go look at the insanely expensive cars." They walked up the drive together. The man in the borrowed suit with the silk scarf and the girl in jeans and a clean polo shirt that Ronan had ironed that morning, using a technique he'd learned from a YouTube video Lila had found while researching tie folding. They looked, Ronan thought, like exactly what they were. A mechanic and his daughter, showing up at a party where they didn't belong because someone had been kind enough to invite them. Celine was waiting at the entrance to the main exhibition tent. She was wearing something dark and simple and expensive, and she had her hair down, which Ronan had never seen before. She looked different. Not better or worse, just different, the way people look when you see them outside the context where you know them. "You came," she said. "We came." "Nice scarf." "It was my wife's." Something moved across Celine's face, a softening, a brief break in the composed exterior she maintained with the discipline of a professional athlete. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it, and didn't say anything else about it because she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, that Ronan's silences were not gaps to be filled but spaces to be respected. She crouched down to Lila's level. "Hey kid, want to see some cars?" "I want to see the ocean." "After the cars, deal?" "Deal. But I'm charging you for the lemonade I'm not selling right now because I'm here instead of at the garage. That's lost revenue." Celine looked up at Ronan. "She's going to be running a Fortune 500 company by the time she's 20. She already runs a lemonade stand with variable pricing and a weekend surcharge. I'm honestly a little scared of her." They went inside. Wotan. The exhibition tent was vast. White canvas stretched over a steel frame, climate-controlled, lit with soft overhead spots that made the cars glow like museum pieces. Because that's what they were, Ronan thought. Museum pieces. Cars that had been restored and preserved and polished to a state of such perfection that they barely looked like machines anymore. They looked like sculptures, like ideas of cars rather than actual cars. He moved through the exhibition slowly, stopping at each vehicle, bending to look at the panel gaps and the paint and the chrome work. He could see the quality, or the lack of it, in every detail. A DB5 with a repaint that was almost perfect but had a faint orange peel texture on the rear quarter panel that told him the painter had been good but not great. A DB6 with chrome bumpers that had been replated beautifully but reinstalled with slightly uneven gaps. A Vantage 5.8 with an engine bay so clean it looked like it had been sterilized, which meant either the car had never been driven or someone had over-restored it to the point where it had lost its character. He didn't say any of this out loud. He just looked and thought and moved on. People noticed him, not because he stood out visually, although the borrowed suit and the scarf and the 9-year-old companion certainly distinguished him from the crowd of wealthy men in bespoke clothing, but because word had already spread. Catherine Park's article had done its work. The collector community was small, and within that community, the story of the mechanic from Millbrook, who had sacrificed a brilliant career to raise his daughter, and who had been smeared by a jealous dealership owner, was, by now, something approaching legend. They approached him carefully at first. The way people approach someone they've read about and aren't sure is real is a man with white hair and a British accent introduced himself as Peter Langton, former head of design at Aston Martin Lagonda, and shook Ronan's hand with both of his own and said, "Gerald Ashcroft told me about you. Said you were the best he'd ever seen. Gerald doesn't say that about anyone." Ronan didn't know what to say to that, so he said, "Thank you," which was insufficient but honest, and Peter Langton seemed to understand the difference. Richard Cavendish found them near the DB4GT Zagato, which was, as Ronan had suspected, the most expensive object within 50 miles. Cavendish was in his 60s, tall and lean, with the sun-damaged skin of a man who'd spent decades driving open-top cars at unreasonable speeds. He took Ronan's hand and held it, and looked at him with the unguarded directness of a person who had enough money and enough years to have stopped performing for anyone. "I read the article," Cavendish said. "Then I made 6 phone calls. Every person I spoke to said the same thing, that Ronan Ellsworth is the real thing, not a brand, not a business, just a man who understands these cars the way the people who built them understood them." "I just fix what's broken," Ronan said. "Son, that's the rarest skill in the world." Cavendish smiled.
Bon.
"Now, come look at this Zagato and tell me what you think, because I've had 3 experts examine it and they all told me different things, and I'm starting to suspect none of them actually know what they're talking about." Ronan spent 20 minutes with the Zagato. Lila spent the same 20 minutes interrogating Richard Cavendish about whether he'd ever been to the ocean and whether Zagatos could go underwater, and Cavendish, a man who had built and sold 2 companies and who sat on the boards of 4 foundations, answered every question with the patient seriousness of someone who understood that a 9-year-old's curiosity was worth more than most adult conversations. And then the DB4 failed. It happened without warning, the way mechanical failures always happen, suddenly, completely, in the worst possible moment. A collector named Warren Haas had brought a 1961 DB4 Series 4 to the expo for a live demonstration, a cold start, meant to show off the car's condition and the quality of its restoration. 300 people gathered around a car worth roughly $2 million, and Warren Haas turned the key, and instead of the deep, authoritative growl of a healthy inline-6, the engine caught for half a second and then died with a sound that made every person in the tent who knew anything about engines wince simultaneously. Haas tried again. Same result. A brief struggling ignition followed by an immediate stall, accompanied by a metallic clicking that sounded expensive and wrong. "That's not good," Lila said from somewhere near Ronan's elbow. "No," Ronan agreed. "That's not good." Haas got out of the car, his face the particular shade of pale that comes from watching something you love and spent a fortune on fail in front of 300 people. The expo's technical director, a man named Burke, popped the hood and stared at the engine with the expression of a surgeon opening a patient and finding something unexpected. "Could be electrical," Burke said. "Could be fuel delivery. Could be mechanical. We'd need to get it on a lift and run a full diagnostic." "We don't have a lift," someone said. "This is a lawn." "Well, we can't diagnose it on a lawn." "We can't just leave it here either. There's a live auction in 40 minutes. The crowd murmured. Experts conferred. Phones were consulted. Opinions were offered, contradicted, revised, and abandoned. It was, Ronan thought, exactly like watching a committee try to solve a problem that didn't require a committee. Too many voices, too many theories, too much ego, and not enough listening. He listened. He stood 10 feet from the car with Lila beside him and Celine behind him, and he listened the way he'd listened to Celine's Vanquish on the gravel lot in Millbrook, with his whole body, with that part of his brain that had been trained not by schools or certifications, but by decades of standing next to engines and hearing what they were trying to say. "Excuse me," he said. Nobody heard him. The committee continued to confer. "Excuse me," he said again, louder. Not shouting. Ronan didn't shout, but with enough authority to cut through the noise. Burke looked up. "Yes? Can I take a look?" Burke frowned. And you are? Ronan Ellsworth. The name moved through the crowd the way a stone moves through water. A brief disruption followed by spreading ripples. Burke's frown deepened, then cleared. The mechanic from Connecticut. That's right. This is a Concours level DB4. It's been restored by one of the top firms in Europe. I can see that. Can I take a look? Burke glanced at Haas. Haas, who had clearly heard the name and read the article and was currently standing next to a dead $2 million car with no better options, nodded. Ronan took off the borrowed jacket and handed it to Celine. He rolled up his sleeves, a gesture so habitual that he did it without thinking, the way a pianist sits down and adjusts the bench before playing. He walked to the car, leaned over the engine bay, and looked. Then he listened. He asked Haas to try the key again. The engine caught and died. The clicking sound repeated. Ronan held up his hand. Once more. Just the key to ignition. Don't try to start it. Haas turned the key to the on position without cranking. Ronan tilted his head, listening to the fuel pump prime. Then he reached into the engine bay with both hands and did something that nobody in the crowd could quite see. His fingers moving among the wiring and the hoses and the mechanical components with a speed and certainty that made several people lean forward involuntarily, trying to understand what they were watching. He straightened up. Try it now. Haas looked at him. What did you do? Your fuel mixture enrichment isn't engaging on cold start. The choke cable has slipped its anchor point by about 3 millimeters, just enough to prevent full engagement. It's a common issue on Series 4 cars when the restoration shop uses reproduction cable brackets instead of original spec. The bracket geometry is slightly different, and the cable walks under thermal cycling. He wiped his hands on his suit pants without thinking about it, leaving 2 dark smudges on the navy fabric. I've reset the anchor. It should hold for now, but you'll want to have the bracket replaced with an original or a properly machined reproduction. 300 people stood in silence. Haas turned the key. The engine caught. Not tentatively, not with hesitation, not with the struggling cough it had produced moments earlier. It caught with the full, deep, immediate authority of a healthy inline six that had been waiting for someone to understand what it needed. The sound filled the tent, rich and resonant and unmistakably alive. And Haas revved it gently, and the engine responded with the kind of perfect, unbroken power curve that made grown men close their eyes and smile. The applause started somewhere near the back of the tent. It spread forward slowly at first, then faster, building from scattered clapping into a sustained ovation that went on for 30 seconds, then 45, then a full minute. 300 people, collectors, engineers, industry veterans, people who had spent their careers around these cars and who understood exactly what they'd just witnessed, stood and applauded a man in a borrowed suit with grease on his pants who had diagnosed and repaired a problem in under 2 minutes that a tent full of experts couldn't have solved in 2 days. Ronan stood beside the car with his sleeves rolled up and grease on his hands and Claire's scarf around his neck and an expression on his face that Celine, watching from the edge of the crowd, would later describe as completely lost. Not embarrassed, not proud, lost. He had no framework for this, for being seen, for being recognized, for being the center of attention in a room full of people who were looking at him with something that went beyond admiration and into territory he had no map for. Lila appeared beside him. She looked at the crowd, then at her father, then back at the crowd. She took his hand, his greasy, calloused mechanic's hand, and held it with the casual possessiveness of a child who understood at 9 years old something that most adults never figured out, that the person standing next to her was not a legend or a genius or a story in a magazine. He was her dad. He fixed things. That was all. That was everything. Dad, she said, tugging his hand, her voice cutting through the applause with the unceremonious clarity of a child who had something more important to discuss. Yeah? Can we go see the ocean now? The laughter started before the applause had fully died, and it carried through the tent like a wave, warm and genuine and exactly what the moment needed. The voice of a 9-year-old girl reminding 300 adults that the most impressive things in the world were still less interesting than the ocean, and that the best mechanic alive was still, first and last, somebody's father. They went to the Chesapeake that afternoon. Ronan drove the truck down to a beach that Celine found on her phone. Quiet stretch of sand on the western shore where the water was calm and the light was going gold. Lila kicked off her shoes and ran straight into the shallows and stood there with the water around her ankles, looking out at the bay with the same focused intensity she brought to octopus research and lemonade pricing, and everything else she cared about. Ronan and Celine stood at the waterline and watched her. The late afternoon sun was behind them, throwing their shadows out across the wet sand toward the water. "You had grease on your pants during the standing ovation," Celine said. "I know, I got grease on your friend's suit. Marcus won't care. Marcus is going to kill me. That suit cost more than my truck." "Your truck cost $800. It cost $1,200. I got a good deal." They were quiet for a moment. The water made small sounds against the shore. Lila was crouching now, examining something in the shallow water with the single-minded focus of a future marine biologist. "How do you feel?" Celine asked. Ronan considered the question. She watched him consider it. Watched the way he turned it over in his mind, the way he turned a wrench, carefully, giving it the attention it deserved before committing to a response. "Tired," he said. "The same kind of tired I always feel. But also something else, something I haven't felt in a long time." "What?" He watched Lila pick something up from the water and hold it up to the light. A shell, or a stone, or some small thing that the bay had offered her. Like maybe it was worth it. Not the expo, not the applause, but coming out here, letting Lila see something besides the garage and the school bus and the inside of our house. Letting her see that her dad— He stopped, started again. "She's never seen anyone clap for me. She's never seen anyone look at me the way those people looked at me today. And I don't need that. I really don't. But maybe she needs to see it. Maybe she needs to know that what I do isn't just fixing old cars in a cinder block building. Maybe she needs to know it matters to somebody besides her." Celine felt her throat tighten. She looked away, at the water, at the far shore, at anything that wasn't Ronan's face, because looking at his face right now would undo something she wasn't ready to have undone. "It matters to a lot of people," she said, "including me. You're paying for the suit cleaning." "I'm paying for the suit cleaning." Lila came running back with her hands cupped around something. "Dad, I found a crab. A tiny one. It's so small it could live in a thimble if crabs knew what thimbles were." Ronan knelt down and looked at the crab. A blue crab no bigger than a thumbnail, sitting in the shallow pool of water in Lila's palms, looking thoroughly unimpressed by its situation. "That's a blue crab," Ronan said. "They're common in the Chesapeake." "Can I keep it?" "No." "What if I name it?" "You can name it and then put it back." "Fine. His name is Gerald, like the guy who said nice things about you." She carried Gerald carefully back to the water's edge and set him down in the shallows with the gentle precision of a child who understood that small things deserve the same care as big things. The crab sat motionless for a moment, then scuttled sideways into the bay and disappeared. "Bye, Gerald," Lila said. "Be safe out there." They drove home that night. Lila fell asleep before they'd left Virginia, curled in the passenger seat with her shoes still sandy and her hands still smelling like the bay. Ronan drove in silence through the dark, through the long stretch of highway between Virginia and Connecticut, through the empty hours where the road becomes a kind of meditation and the headlights create a private world that extends exactly as far as you can see and no further. He thought about the applause. He thought about the way 300 people had stood and clapped and looked at him as though he'd done something extraordinary, when all he'd done was listen to an engine and hear what it was saying. He thought about Gerald Ashcroft's words, "the best I've ever seen," and about Richard Cavendish's handshake, and about Peter Langton holding his hand with both of his own, and about how all of that felt good and also felt like it belonged to someone else, some version of himself that had taken a different path and ended up in a different life. But mostly, he thought about Lila standing in the bay with water around her ankles, holding a crab in her cupped hands and naming it after a man who'd said kind things about her father. He thought about the way she'd taken his hand during the ovation, not because she understood what was happening, but because she understood what mattered, which was that he was her dad, and she was beside him, and the rest was noise. Claire would have liked today. She would have liked the borrowed suit and the silk scarf, and the grease on the pants and the standing ovation, and the tiny crab named Gerald. She would have stood at the waterline with her arms crossed and her head tilted, and that dry, knowing look on her face, and she would have said something that made him laugh, something that cut through all the noise and the emotion and landed on the one true thing, the way she always did. He missed her. He missed her the way he always missed her, which was constantly and specifically, and in a way that didn't diminish but simply became part of the architecture of his days, built into the foundation like rebar and concrete, invisible, essential, bearing the weight of everything above it. Lila shifted in her sleep, murmured something about octopuses, and settled again. Ronan reached over and pulled her jacket up around her shoulders. The road stretched ahead, dark and straight and leading home, and he drove through the night with his sleeping daughter beside him, and the memory of applause fading behind him like a sound you hear once and carry with you and never quite forget. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. The video from the expo, shot by at least a dozen people on their phones and uploaded before Ronan had even left the tent, spread across collector forums and automotive channels within hours. By the next morning, it had been picked up by 2 mainstream automotive publications and a national news site that ran it under a headline about the mechanic who silenced a room of experts. The footage was shaky and the audio was imperfect, but the essentials were unmistakable. A man in a borrowed suit leaning into an engine bay, doing something no one else in the room could do, and then the sound of the engine coming alive, and then the applause, and then... This was the part that people watched again and again, the part that made the video travel. A 9-year-old girl taking her father's hand and asking if they could go see the ocean. Within a week, Ronan's phone was ringing so constantly that he started leaving it in the house while he worked. Lila, who had appointed herself his unofficial secretary, answered the calls with a professionalism that oscillated between genuine helpfulness and entrepreneurial opportunism. Ellsworth Auto, this is Lila. My dad is under a car right now. Can I take a message? Also, we don't have a website, but I'm working on it. She kept the messages in a spiral notebook, each entry recorded in her careful, slightly oversized handwriting. By the end of the second week, she had filled 17 pages. Collectors from Massachusetts, Virginia, California, Texas, a man in Florida with a DB5 convertible who said he'd been waiting 2 years for someone he trusted to touch it. A woman in Oregon with a V8 Vantage that she'd inherited from her father and that hadn't run in a decade. A film producer in Los Angeles who offered to fly Ronan out first class to look at his collection, and Lila had written next to this entry, in parentheses, "Dad will never do this, but I wrote it down anyway because it's interesting." The former colleagues came forward one by one, then in a wave. Gerald Ashcroft's interview had opened a door that 6 years of silence had kept sealed, and now the people who had worked alongside Ronan at Pemberton, people who had watched him fight for standards that the company had abandoned, people who had admired his courage and been ashamed of their own compliance, began reaching out. Some called Celine, some called Catherine Park, some called Ronan directly, and those were the calls he actually took, sitting on the porch in the evening with Lila doing homework at the folding table and the radio playing through the garage's open bay door. Alan McCready, who had been the junior engineer on Ronan's team at Pemberton, called on a Wednesday night. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, and his voice had the rough quality of a man who'd been rehearsing the words and still wasn't sure they were adequate. "I should have backed you up. When you filed those reports, when you refused to sign off, I agreed with everything you said, and I sat in my chair and kept my mouth shut because I was 24 and scared." "You were 24 and scared," Ronan said. "That's not something you need to apologize for. I've thought about it every day for 6 years. Stop thinking about it. You've got better things to spend your days on." "Do I?" "Yeah, you do. How's the Vantage project going? I heard you moved to a shop in Bristol." "You heard about that?" "People talk. Is the Vantage the Series 2, the one with the Weber carbs?" And just like that, the conversation shifted from guilt to carburetors, which was where Ronan was most comfortable and where he suspected most conversations would be better if they started. Alan talked for an hour about the Vantage restoration and the challenges of sourcing original Weber components and the particular nightmare of matching paint on a 40-year-old car. And Ronan listened and offered advice and felt for the first time in years that the world he'd left behind was reaching back toward him, not to pull him in, but to acknowledge that he'd been right, and that his absence had left a space that no one else had been able to fill. The formal corrections came next. The automotive blogs that had published the smear articles, the ones that had quietly deleted them after Catherine Park's piece ran, were now being pressured by their own readers to issue retractions. The collector community, it turned out, had a long memory and a low tolerance for dishonesty, and the blog's attempts to pretend the articles had never existed only made things worse. Within 3 weeks, both publications issued formal corrections, acknowledging that their coverage of Ronan Ellsworth had been based on incomplete and misleading information provided by a source with a financial conflict of interest. Neither named Damian Cross. Neither needed to. Cross himself had gone quiet. His dealerships were still operating, his service center was still open, but the steady stream of high-end Aston Martin clients that had been the foundation of his reputation had slowed to a trickle. Marcus Whitehall, who kept track of these things the way some people kept track of baseball statistics, told Celine that Cross Automotive's premium service division had lost more than half its revenue since the Expo video went viral. "He's finished," Marcus said over dinner. "Not bankrupt. He's got enough non-Aston business to keep the lights on. But in this community, he's done. Nobody trusts him. Nobody wants to be associated with him. He tried to destroy the best mechanic in the country, and the whole thing blew up in his face." "He destroyed himself," Celine said. "Ronan didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. All we did was tell the truth. Cross did the rest." That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. The truth doesn't need to be weaponized. It just needs to be visible. She believed that. She was surprised to find that she believed it, because for most of her career she had operated on the opposite assumption. That truth was a tool, a resource to be deployed strategically, a form of leverage. Ronan had taught her something different, not by arguing or persuading, but simply by existing. That truth, left alone, had its own weight and its own momentum, and that the most effective thing you could do with it was get out of its way. The investors started calling in October. The first was a private equity firm from Boston that wanted to explore partnership opportunities with Ellsworth Auto. Ronan listened politely for 3 minutes, said, "No thank you," and hung up. The second was a venture capital group from New York that proposed building a chain of boutique Aston Martin service centers under Ronan's name, a luxury brand built on authenticity, which was a phrase that made Ronan close his eyes and pinch the bridge of his nose in a way that Lila found endlessly entertaining. "They want to franchise your name, Dad." "I know what they want. It's kind of flattering. It's kind of terrifying. You could be rich. I could be miserable. I've been rich adjacent. Rich adjacent people are the most miserable people I've ever met." Celine's not miserable. Ronan looked at his daughter. She was sitting on the porch steps with her notebook open, surrounded by the day's messages, her hair coming out of its ponytail in the way it always did by late afternoon. She had the straightforward, unfiltered gaze of a child who didn't yet know that some observations were supposed to be kept to yourself. "Celine's different," he said. "How?" "She's figuring things out. Most rich people stopped figuring things out a long time ago. They decided what mattered, and they were wrong, and they're too invested to change their minds." "And Celine's not too invested?" "Celine's the kind of person who'd rather be right than comfortable. That's rare, especially in people with money." Lila wrote something in her notebook. Ronan leaned over to look. She'd written, "Dad thinks Celine is rare." She saw him reading and snapped the notebook shut. "That's private," she said. "You're 9. Nothing is private." "I'm almost 10, and everything is private. Mrs. Tierney says journals are sacred spaces." "Mrs. Tierney is absolutely right, and I'm going to stop looking at your notebook." "Good." The third investor call was from a man named Philip Trent, who ran a luxury automotive group out of Greenwich and who offered Ronan $5 million for exclusive rights to use his name and methodology. Ronan didn't even listen to the full pitch. He said no before Trent had finished explaining the equity structure, and when Trent asked why, Ronan said something that Lila, who was absolutely listening from inside the screen door, later wrote down in her notebook, word for word. "Because the second you put my name on something I don't control, it stops being my name. It becomes a logo. And I'm not a logo. I'm a mechanic who makes promises about the cars he touches. And the only way those promises mean anything is if I'm the one keeping them." Trent, to his credit, didn't argue. He said he understood, which he probably didn't, and wished Ronan well, which he probably meant, and hung up and Ronan went back to the garage and back to the 1967 DB6 on the lift that had arrived from Newport that morning with a fuel injection issue that 3 other shops had misdiagnosed. The cars kept coming, not because of the video or the article or the expo or anything that had happened in the public sphere, but because of the same reason they'd always come. Because Ronan Ellsworth could hear what engines were saying, and because the people who owned those engines had learned, through word of mouth and personal experience, that there was exactly one person in the country who could be trusted to listen. They came from everywhere now. Not just the East Coast, but from Michigan and Texas and Colorado and California. A DB4 GT from a museum in Chicago that needed its engine rebuilt. A 177 from a technology executive in San Francisco who had tried every authorized service center on the West Coast before someone told him about the garage in Millbrook. An Aston Martin Vulcan, a track-only hypercar worth $3 million, that arrived on a flatbed truck at 7 in the morning and made Lila come running out of the house in her pajamas to stare at it with her mouth open. "That," she said, "is the coolest thing I have ever seen in my entire life, and I have seen an octopus on television." "It's a Vulcan," Ronan said, already walking around the car, already assessing it the way he assessed everything. With his eyes and his ears and his hands and the part of his mind that spoke engine the way other people spoke English. "Can you fix it?" "Let me find out what's wrong with it first." "Can I sit in it?" "Absolutely not." "Can I sit near it?" "You can sit in the garage at your table and do your homework near it." "That's basically the same thing." "It is not basically the same thing." She sat at her table and did her homework near it, and Ronan worked on the Vulcan for 3 days, and when the owner came to pick it up, he tried to pay Ronan $20,000, and Ronan charged him the calculated cost of labor and parts, which came to $1,800, and the owner stared at the invoice the way people stare at things they don't understand, and then he shook Ronan's hand and drove away in a car that was, for the first time since he'd owned it, running exactly the way its engineers had intended. Celine came out to Millbrook on a Saturday afternoon in early November. The trees were bare now, the maples along the road reduced to their essential architecture, dark branches against a gray sky, the kind of austere beauty that you only noticed if you were paying attention. She'd been coming out every couple of weeks, sometimes with a reason, sometimes without. Ronan had stopped asking why. She had stopped pretending she needed a reason. She found him on the porch, sitting in one of the mismatched chairs with a mug of coffee and a stillness that she'd come to recognize as his version of contentment. Not happiness, exactly. Ronan didn't do happiness in the uncomplicated, effervescent way that word usually implied. He did something quieter and more durable. A settled acceptance of things as they were, which included both the good and the bad, and didn't try to pretend one outweighed the other. "Where's Lila?" Celine asked, sitting down in the other chair. "Inside. She's building a website for the garage. She says I need an online presence." She's not wrong. She's never wrong. That's the problem. She's 9 years old, and she's never wrong, and in about 4 years she's going to be a teenager who's never wrong, and I'm going to be in serious trouble. Celine smiled. She'd been smiling more lately, she realized. Not the practiced professional smile she deployed in meetings and at events, but something less controlled, less deliberate. Something that started before she decided to let it. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to listen without arguing." "That's a bad start." "I owe you an apology." Ronan looked at her. "For what?" "For the day I first drove up to this garage. For what I was thinking when I got out of my car and saw you in your work shirt and your grease in this place." She gestured at the garage, the cinder blocks, the faded sign. "I assumed things about you, about who you were and what you were capable of and what your life meant. I looked at where you worked and what you wore and how you lived, and I made a judgment, and it was wrong. It was completely, fundamentally wrong." "You weren't wrong. I'm a mechanic in a cinder block garage. That's what you saw, and that's what I am. That's what you do. It's not what you are. What you are is, I don't have the right word for it. You're someone who decided that integrity matters more than recognition, that being a good father matters more than being a famous engineer, that doing the work right matters more than being rewarded for it. And I didn't see any of that when I pulled up in my $300,000 car and assumed you were guessing because you didn't have the right equipment." Ronan was quiet for a moment, He turned his coffee mug in his hands, a gesture she'd seen 100 times now, his version of thinking, the way his hands always needed to be doing something even when the rest of him was still. "You don't owe me an apology for being human," he said. "Everybody makes assumptions. That's how brains work. You meet someone, you take in the data that's available, the clothes, the setting, the context, and you draw a conclusion. That's not a moral failure. That's pattern recognition. It's lazy pattern recognition. Sure, but you course corrected. That's the part that matters. You saw something that didn't match your assumptions, and you updated your assumptions instead of doubling down. Most people don't do that. Most people hold on to the first story they tell themselves about somebody, because changing the story is uncomfortable and staying wrong is easier than admitting you were wrong. When did you become a philosopher? I've been under a lot of cars. You think about things when you're under cars. Lila came out through the screen door with a laptop that was older than she was. I need to take a picture of you for the website, both of you. Stand by the garage. I don't want to be on the website, Ronan said. You're the mechanic. You have to be on the website. It's like a restaurant not showing the food. I'm not food. You're the equivalent of food in this metaphor, Dad. Just stand by the garage and try to look like someone who fixes nice cars. I am someone who fixes nice cars. Then it should be easy. Come on. They stood by the garage, Ronan in his gray work shirt, Celine in her dark coat, both of them squinting slightly against the November light. Lila held up the ancient laptop, which apparently had a camera, and directed them with the authoritative confidence of a 9-year-old who had watched enough YouTube to know that content creation was serious business. Celine, move closer. Dad, stop making that face. What face? The face that says you'd rather be under a car. Just look normal. This is my normal face. Your normal face looks like you'd rather be under a car. That's my point. She lowered the laptop. Fine. I'll use it anyway. It's authentic, which is more important than attractive. That's what the website tutorials say. Great, Ronan said. Authentic and unattractive. Put that on the home page. I'm putting it on the About page. The home page is going to have the sign. What sign? Lila closed the laptop and looked at him with an expression that contained simultaneously the patient affection of a daughter who loved her father unconditionally and the mild exasperation of a small business consultant dealing with a resistant client. I made a sign for the garage. It's drying inside. You can see it later. What does it say? It's a surprise. Lila, it's a surprise, Dad. Surprises are good. They build anticipation and increase emotional engagement. I read that in a marketing book. Why are you reading marketing books? Because somebody in this family has to understand business. She went back inside with the laptop and the particular dignity of a person who had made her point and didn't need to belabor it. Celine watched her go and felt something she'd been feeling more and more often in the weeks since the expo. A warmth that started somewhere in her chest and spread outward, the physical sensation of caring about people in a way that had nothing to do with strategy or investment or return. She cared about Lila the way you care about a kid who charges you $5 for lemonade and lectures you about marketing and names crabs after retired engineers. She cared about Ronan the way you care about a person who has shown you, without trying, that the things you valued most in your life might not be the things that matter most. She wasn't in love with him. She'd examined that possibility with the same rigor she applied to investment decisions, and concluded that what she felt was something different, less dramatic maybe, but more durable. She respected him. She admired him. She trusted him, which was the rarest thing of all, because Celine Ashbourne trusted almost nobody. And she wanted, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, to be part of the life he'd built, not at its center, not as a partner or a replacement for Claire, but as a presence, a friend, someone who showed up and stayed. I should probably go, she said. I've got a call with Tokyo at 7. On a Saturday? Money doesn't know what day it is. That's a terrible way to live. I'm working on it. She stood up, paused. Ronan, can I ask you something? You're going to ask me whether I'm happy. She blinked. How did you know that? Because you've been working up to it for 3 weeks, and because it's the question people ask when they care about someone and don't know how else to show it. He set down his coffee mug. The answer is, I don't know. I don't think about it in those terms. I think about whether Lila's okay, whether the work is good, whether I'm doing right by the people who trust me with their cars. And by those measures, yeah, I'm okay. I'm more than okay. But are you happy? He looked at her with those tired, patient eyes, the eyes that had seen engines and grief and the inside of a tiny garage for 6 years, the eyes that missed nothing and demanded nothing and carried always the quiet weight of a man who had loved someone completely and lost her and kept going because there was a child who needed him to keep going. I'm not unhappy, he said. And in my experience, that's about as good as it gets. The people who tell you they're happy all the time are either lying or not paying attention. Life isn't designed for happiness. It's designed for, purpose, connection, doing work that means something, raising a kid who charges strangers for lemonade and reads about octopuses and builds websites on a laptop from 2011. He almost smiled. That's not happiness. That's something better. That's enough. Celine looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and walked to her car. She got in, started the engine, still perfect, still the precise, alive sound that Ronan had restored to it months ago, and drove down the gravel driveway and turned onto the quiet street and headed home through the November afternoon. She was 3 miles down the road when she pulled over and sat in the car and cried. Not sad crying, she wasn't sad. She was overwhelmed by something she didn't have a name for, something that had been building inside her for weeks. The accumulated weight of watching a man live a life that contradicted everything she'd believed about what mattered. She cried for 5 minutes, wiped her eyes, blew her nose on a tissue from the glove compartment, and pulled back onto the road and drove home. She would never tell him about the crying. It wasn't the kind of thing either of them would be comfortable discussing. But she would remember it, the moment she pulled over on a 2-lane road in Connecticut and sat in a car that a mechanic had fixed and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that she understood something important about what it means to be a person. The sign went up on a Sunday morning in late November. Lila had painted it herself on a piece of plywood she'd found in the garage, using house paint from a can that Ronan had been saving for the porch shutters. The lettering was uneven, and the colors were slightly off, and there was a drip of blue paint in one corner that she'd tried to turn into a decorative swoosh, and that looked honestly like a drip of blue paint that someone had tried to turn into a swoosh. It was imperfect and handmade and completely, utterly Lila. It read, Tiny Garage, Big Engines. Ronan stood in the gravel lot and looked at it. Lila stood beside him, bouncing slightly on her toes, vibrating with the particular anxiety of a child who has made something and is waiting to find out whether the person she made it for thinks it's any good. Well, she said. He didn't say anything for a long time. Long enough that Lila's bouncing slowed and her expression shifted from anxious anticipation to concern. Dad, do you hate it? Because I can make another one. I have more plywood. And I was thinking maybe I should have used a stencil, but Mrs. Tierney says handmade things have more character. And Lila, yeah? It's perfect. It's kind of crooked. I know. It's perfect. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then she was hugging him, her arms around his waist, her face pressed against his work shirt, holding on with the uncomplicated ferocity of a child who loved her father and wanted him to know it. And he put his hand on the back of her head and held her there and looked at the sign above his garage, the crooked, dripping, handmade sign that his daughter had painted on a piece of scrap plywood. And he thought that if he never accomplished another thing in his life, he had accomplished the only thing that actually mattered. Marcus Whitehall drove out the following week and saw the sign and laughed and took a picture and texted it to every collector he knew. Within 24 hours, Tiny Garage, Big Engines, had become a phrase that people in the Aston Martin collector community used the way other communities used inside jokes, a shorthand for authenticity, for quality, for the stubborn refusal to be anything other than what you are. The neighbors were the last to come around, which made sense because neighbors are always the last to revise their opinions. For years, the people on Ronan Street had regarded the garage as a mild nuisance. The gravel lot, the occasional sound of engines, the clients' expensive cars parked incongruously on a street of modest houses. They hadn't complained exactly, but they hadn't been enthusiastic either. The garage was just there, the way Ronan was just there, part of the neighborhood, but not quite of it, tolerated but not celebrated. That changed gradually. in the small, unglamorous ways that opinions change in small towns. Mrs. Peterson, whose Buick Ronin had been maintaining for years at a price she could afford, started telling people at the general store that the mechanic on Elm Street was apparently some kind of genius, if you can believe it. Mr. Garza, the man who'd brought the pie after Ronin fixed his truck, began parking his lawn chair on his own porch on Saturday mornings so he could watch the expensive cars arrive and offer unsolicited commentary on their relative merits. The family across the street, who had 2 teenagers and a minivan with a persistent exhaust rattle, brought it to Ronin one afternoon and he fixed it in 20 minutes and charged them nothing. And the mother stood in the driveway afterward and said, "We've been living next to you for 4 years and I had no idea." "No idea about what?" Ronin said. "About all of this. About who you are." Ronin wiped his hands on the rag. "I'm the same person I was yesterday. And the day before that. And the day before that. I know. That's what I mean." The line of cars waiting for Ronin's attention now stretched weeks into the future. He didn't rush. He didn't hire help. He didn't expand. He took each car in the order it arrived, gave it the time and attention it required, and moved on to the next. Some collectors complained about the wait. Most didn't. Most understood, or were learning to understand, that the wait was part of the value, that a car repaired by Ronin Ellsworth was a car that had been listened to, understood, and treated with the respect it deserved, and that kind of work couldn't be scaled or hurried or delegated. Celine came out on a Thursday afternoon in December, the last visit before the holidays, which she was spending alone in Hartford, because that was what she always did, and because changing a tradition, even a lonely one, required an initiative she hadn't yet mustered. She brought Lila a book about deep-sea creatures that she'd found at a bookstore in the city, and she brought Ronin nothing, because Ronin didn't want things, and she'd learned to respect that. They sat on the porch in the cold. Lila was inside, already deep in the book, making sounds of amazement at regular intervals. The garage was closed for the day. The gravel lot was empty. The sign, "Tiny Garage." Big engines. Hung above the bay door, crooked and paint-dripped and exactly right. "I've been thinking," Celine said. "Dangerous. I've been thinking about what you said, about happiness, about how life isn't designed for happiness. It's designed for purpose and connection and doing work that means something." I said something like that. You said exactly that, and I've been turning it over ever since because it contradicts basically everything I've built my life around. My entire career, my entire philosophy, has been organized around the idea that success, money, influence, the ability to control outcomes, is the thing that makes a life worth living. And then I met you, and you have none of those things, and your life is, I don't want to say better, because that's condescending and also not accurate. Your life is harder than mine in a lot of ways, but it's more coherent. It makes sense. There's a line that runs through everything you do, from the way you fix cars to the way you raise Lila to the way you handle people like Damian Cross. And that line is, do the work, do it right. Be there for the people who depend on you, and everything else is noise. Ronin didn't respond immediately. He looked out at the street, at the houses across the road, at the bare trees standing against the gray December sky like bones of something enormous that had settled there to rest. "You're giving me too much credit," he said. "I didn't choose this life because I had some philosophy about purpose and connection. I chose it because my wife died and my kid needed me, and I didn't have the energy for anything else. That's not wisdom. That's survival." Maybe wisdom and survival are the same thing. Maybe. Or maybe I just got lucky. Lucky that the thing I'm good at is something I can do in a garage in my backyard. Lucky that the thing my daughter needs is just me, being here, every day. If I'd been a surgeon or a pilot or anything that required me to be somewhere else, I don't know what I would have done. I might have made all the wrong choices. I might have chosen the career and lost the kid. I don't know. Nobody knows what they'd do in a situation they haven't been in. You wouldn't have lost her. You don't know that. I do know that, because I've watched you for months, and the one thing I know for certain about you is that Lila comes first. Not because you decided she comes first, because she is first. It's not a choice for you. It's just how you're built. He looked at her. The late afternoon light was thin and gray and carried no warmth, and his face was tired the way it always was. that permanent, structural tiredness that had become so much a part of him that she couldn't imagine him without it. Couldn't imagine what he'd look like rested and unburdened, and didn't want to, because the tiredness was part of what made him who he was. It was the tiredness of a man who showed up every day, who did the work, who carried the weight, who went to bed exhausted and got up and did it again. Not because he was heroic, but because that was what the life he'd chosen required, and he'd made his peace with it. "Claire would have liked you," he said. The words landed in the cold air between them and sat there, solid and quiet and immeasurably heavy. It was the first time he'd said Claire's name to her without being asked about it, the first time he'd volunteered something about his wife that wasn't in response to a question or a prompt. And Celine understood, in the way you understand things that matter, that this was not a casual statement. This was Ronan Ellsworth, who measured his words the way he measured engine tolerances, precisely, carefully, with full awareness of their significance, telling her that she had earned something precious. Not his love, not his need, his trust. The trust of a man who had lost the person he loved most, and who had spent 6 years protecting the space she'd left behind, and who was now, quietly and without fanfare, allowing someone else to stand near it. "I would have liked her too," Celine said. "She was funnier than me, which isn't hard. Most people are funnier than you. Thanks. You're welcome." They sat in the cold for a while longer, not talking, watching the light fade over the street. A car passed. A dog barked somewhere. Inside the house, Lila shouted, "Dad, there's a fish that can walk on land. An actual fish with legs." And Ronan called back, "It's called a mud skipper." And Lila said, "How do you know everything?" And Ronan said, "I don't know everything. I know about mud skippers and engines. That's about it." And Lila said, "That's a weird combination." And Ronan said, "Go back to your book." And the house settled back into the quiet sounds of a Thursday evening. The heater cycling on, the creak of old floorboards, the soft turning of pages. Celine stood up. "I should go. Tokyo doesn't wait. Tokyo needs to learn about work-life balance. I'll suggest it at the next board meeting." She paused at the steps. "Merry Christmas, Ronan." "Merry Christmas, Celine. I'll see you in the new year. You know where to find me." She did. She knew exactly where to find him. He would be here, in the garage, under a car, with grease on his hands and his daughter doing homework at the folding table and the radio playing something old and the photograph of Claire on the wall and the sign above the door, crooked and handmade, saying everything that needed to be said about what this place was and who the man inside it was. She drove home through the December dark. The Vanquish responded to every touch, every input, every subtle shift of pressure on the accelerator with the precision and fidelity that Ronan had given it. Not just fixed, but understood. Not just repaired, but known. The way you know a song so well you can hear it in your head even when no one's playing it. She thought about Ronan, alone on the porch, going inside to make dinner for his daughter, to help with homework, to read or not read, and then to sleep and then to wake up and do it all again. She thought about the garage and the sign and the cars that would keep coming, and the man who would fix them one by one with his hands and his ears and his knowledge and his patience, charging what was fair and refusing what wasn't earned, and going home at the end of every day to the only person whose opinion of him actually mattered. She thought about what she'd learned from him. Not any specific lesson, not any piece of advice or wisdom, but something more fundamental. Something about the difference between building a life and building a reputation. About how the people who matter most are usually the ones who care least about being noticed. About how the deepest kind of strength isn't the kind that wins fights, but the kind that doesn't need to fight at all. About how a man in a gray work shirt in a town without a traffic light could know more about what matters, about the real machinery of a meaningful life, than anyone in a boardroom or a corner office or a penthouse in Hartford. She thought about Lila, about the lemonade stand and the ledger and the spiral notebook and the marketing books and the sign above the garage. Tiny garage, big engines, painted on scrap plywood by a 9-year-old girl who understood, without being taught, that the things we make with our own hands, however crooked, however imperfect, carry more weight than anything we could buy. And she thought about Claire, whom she'd never met and never would. Claire, who existed only in a photograph on a garage wall and in the eyes of a man who still loved her. and in the gestures and expressions and dry humor of a daughter who carried her forward into the world every day without knowing it. Claire, who had died and left behind a husband who became a father, who became a mechanic, who became, without trying or wanting or asking for it, the most respected craftsman in his field, not because he sought greatness, but because he refused to be anything other than what he was. The road was dark and empty and straight. The headlights cut through the December night, and the engine hummed, and the car moved forward, and Celine drove home through the quiet country toward the city lights, and she thought about the thing Ronan had said that she couldn't stop thinking about, the thing she would carry with her long after this evening and this year and this chapter of her life had become memory. Life isn't designed for happiness. It's designed for purpose, for connection, for doing work that means something. She had spent 30 years pursuing happiness and finding success instead, and success, it turned out, was not the same thing, not even close. It was Ronan who had shown her the difference. Ronan with his cinder block garage and his borrowed suit and his tired eyes, and his daughter who charged people for lemonade and named crabs after retired engineers and painted signs on scrapwood and believed with the unshakable faith of a child who had never been given a reason to doubt that her father was the greatest man alive. Maybe she was right. Maybe greatness wasn't what Celine had always thought it was. The accumulation of wealth and power and influence, the ability to move markets and shape outcomes and bend the world to your will. Maybe greatness was smaller than that, quieter. Maybe it was showing up every day to a job you believed in and a child who believed in you. Maybe it was fixing things that were broken and charging what was fair and going home at night knowing that you'd done your best and that your best was enough. Maybe it was a crooked sign above a garage door, painted by hands that were too small and too eager and too full of love to worry about getting it perfect. Tiny garage, big engines. That was the whole story. And it was exactly precisely enough.